Case 1. T.J. Lane. It was a Monday morning in February 2012 when students at Chardon High School gathered in the cafeteria before classes began. Some ate breakfast. Others waited for buses that would take them to vocational programs at nearby schools. For most, it was an ordinary start to an ordinary week. For 3 students seated at one particular table, it would be their last morning alive. Thomas Michael Lane III was 17 years old that winter. He was not a student at Chardon High School anymore. He attended Lake Academy Alternative School in nearby Willoughby, a program designed for students struggling with academic or behavioral issues. But Lane still took the bus from Chardon High each morning, riding with students who attended the Auburn Career Center. On February 27, 2012, he arrived at Chardon High, carrying more than his backpack. Lane's childhood had been marked by instability. His father, Thomas Lane Jr., had been arrested multiple times for violent crimes against women, including Lane's mother, according to court documents. By the time he was a teenager, Lane lived with his grandparents. Friends described him as quiet, even normal, though those who knew him better saw signs of deeper troubles. On December 30, 2011, Lane posted a lengthy, dark message on Facebook. It included the line, "Die all of you." When questioned later, he claimed it had been a class assignment. No one followed up. That Monday morning, Lane walked into the cafeteria at approximately 7:30 a.m. He pulled a .22 caliber handgun from his bag and approached a table where 5 students sat waiting for their bus. Without warning, without words, he opened fire. The shots came in rapid succession. 10 rounds fired in a matter of seconds. Students screamed. Some ran for the exits. Others dove under tables or froze in place, unable to process what was happening. Daniel Parmertor, 16 years old, was shot and killed. Demetrius Hewlin, also 16, died from his injuries. Russell King Jr., 17, was fatally wounded. 3 other students at the table were injured, but survived. Lane fired at them at close range, moving methodically from one target to the next. When the shooting stopped, he walked calmly toward the exit. A teacher named Frank Hall chased him from the building, preventing further violence. Lane was arrested near his car in the parking lot minutes later. Investigators struggled to identify a motive. Lane had known some of the victims from middle school, but there was no evidence of ongoing conflict. One early theory suggested that Russell King Jr. had been dating Lane's ex-girlfriend, but this was never confirmed as the driving factor. The truth appeared simpler and more disturbing. Lane had chosen that table randomly. The students were simply there when he decided to shoot. In the aftermath, the community of Chardon struggled to comprehend what had happened. Chardon is a small town, about 30 miles east of Cleveland, where people know their neighbors, and violence of this nature seemed unimaginable. Memorial services filled local churches. Students returned to school days later, walking past the cafeteria where their classmates had died. Counselors worked overtime. Parents held their children closer. Everyone asked the same question: why? Lane showed no interest in answering. He was arrested, charged as an adult with 3 counts of aggravated murder, 2 counts of attempted aggravated murder, and 1 count of felonious assault. He pleaded not guilty initially, but in February 2013, he changed his plea to guilty on all charges. The guilty plea meant there would be no trial, no lengthy examination of his motives or mental state. It also meant families would face him directly at sentencing. The sentencing hearing took place on March 19, 2013, in Geauga County Common Pleas Court. Judge David Fury would determine Lane's fate, though the outcome was largely predetermined. Ohio law required life sentences for aggravated murder. The only question was whether they would run consecutively or concurrently, and whether parole would ever be possible. What no one anticipated was how Lane would behave. Lane arrived wearing a blue button-down shirt. Once seated, he unbuttoned it to reveal a white T-shirt underneath. Across the front, he had written the word "Killer" in black marker. It was the same shirt he had worn during the shooting. The families seated in the courtroom felt the air leave the room. This was not an expression of remorse. This was a taunt. When given the opportunity to address the court, Lane stood. His statement was brief, crude, and intentionally hurtful. He used profane language to dismiss the victims and their families. He ended by saying the expletive, followed by "all of you," and raised his middle finger toward the courtroom. Some family members wept. Others stared in stunned silence. Lane smirked. Dina Parmertor, Daniel's mother, told the court she wanted Lane to feel her anger. She said she refused to give him another second of her thoughts after that day, calling him repulsive. Lane laughed as she spoke. Other family members delivered their statements with Lane showing no emotion beyond occasional grins. The prosecutor called him simply an evil person, acknowledging that no explanation had ever been provided for his actions. Judge Fury sentenced Lane to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The judge noted that Lane appeared to have committed the murders to make a big splash and make front-page news. He said Lane had methodically and consciously carried out his plan and showed no signs of remorse or rehabilitation potential. Lane smiled when the sentence was read. He was 18 years old and would spend the rest of his life in prison. But Lane was not finished causing pain. On September 11, 2014, he escaped from the Allen Oakwood Correctional Institution in Lima, Ohio, along with 2 other inmates. They used a makeshift ladder to scale a fence during recreation time. The escape triggered a massive manhunt. Chardon High School was closed the following day as a precaution. Parents who thought they had reached some form of closure were thrown back into fear. Lane was captured about 6 hours later, found near the woods less than 100 yards from the prison. He was transferred to a maximum security facility. Today, Lane is incarcerated at the Warren Correctional Institution in Youngstown, Ohio, a supermax prison with far stricter conditions than his previous facility. He will remain there for the rest of his life. According to prison records, he has continued to rack up disciplinary infractions, including giving himself tattoos and urinating on walls. His behavior suggests no evolution, no growth, no recognition of what he destroyed. The question that haunts Chardon is not just what Lane did, but who he became in that courtroom. Some young offenders express remorse, claim mental illness, or show some human response to the devastation they caused. Lane did none of these things. He wore his crime like a badge. He mocked grieving parents. He transformed his sentencing into a second act of violence against families already shattered. How does someone so young become so disconnected from basic human empathy? Lane's father had modeled violence. His childhood lacked stability. He attended alternative school for behavioral issues. But thousands of teenagers face similar circumstances without becoming killers, and fewer still taunt the families of their victims in open court. Lane's cruelty felt performative, as if he was playing a role he had written for himself. The scary part is that he seemed to enjoy it. Frank Hall, the coach who chased Lane from the building that day, founded the Coach Hall Foundation to help survivors share their stories at other schools. He hopes that by speaking about what happened, they can prevent similar tragedies. The families of the victims continue to advocate for awareness of warning signs in young people. They point to Lane's Facebook post, to the disciplinary issues, to the troubled home life. They ask, what if someone had paid attention? For the 3 young men who died that Monday morning, there are no second chances. Daniel Parmertor wanted to work in computer technology. Demetrius Hewlin dreamed of attending Ohio State University. Russell King Jr. was passionate about helping others and had defended Lane against bullies in the past. They were 16 and 17 years old. with futures that stretched ahead of them. Lane took those futures in less than a minute. The legacy of T.J. Lane is not just the crime itself, but the callousness that followed. His sentencing became one of the most disturbing hearings in modern American legal history, not because of the sentence imposed, but because of the defendant's complete lack of humanity. Families who came seeking some form of acknowledgement, some small sign that Lane understood the magnitude of his actions, left with nothing but more pain. In a system designed to deliver justice, Lane delivered only additional cruelty. He remains in that Supermax facility in Youngstown, serving 3 life sentences that will never end. He will grow older behind those walls, surrounded by others deemed too dangerous for general prison populations. Whether he ever reflects on what he did, whether some kernel of conscience might someday emerge, remains unknown. Based on everything he has shown the world, it seems unlikely. At 17, T.J. Lane made a choice that ended 3 lives and destroyed countless others. At 18, in that courtroom, he made clear that he did not care. Case 2, Nikolas Cruz. February 14, 2018, Valentine's Day. A day meant for love, laughter, and candy hearts pressed into teenage palms between classes. At Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, a sprawling campus in an affluent suburb 30 miles northwest of Fort Lauderdale, students were counting down the final hours before the long President's Day weekend. Some clutched bouquets of roses. Others exchanged cards decorated with hearts. Nobody noticed the Uber pulling into the parking lot at 2:19 p.m., 20 minutes before dismissal. The passenger stepping out was no stranger to these hallways. 19-year-old Nikolas Cruz had walked these corridors as a student until his expulsion the previous year. Now he returned carrying a black soft-sided rifle case and a backpack. Inside that case, an AR-15 style semi-automatic rifle. Inside the backpack, ammunition magazines and a plan to commit mass murder. What happened next would become one of the deadliest school shootings in American history. 17 people, 14 students, and 3 beloved staff members would never leave that building alive. 17 more would be wounded, and a nation would be forced once again to confront the horrifying question, how did we let this happen? But this case is about more than the body count. It's about a young man who fell through every crack in the system. It's about warning signs screamed into deaf ears. It's about heroes who gave their lives to save others. And ultimately, it's about 3 jurors who looked at overwhelming evidence of premeditated murder and said, no, we will not sentence him to death. That decision, to spare Nikolas Cruz from execution, would spark outrage, change Florida law, and leave victims' families feeling betrayed by the very justice system meant to protect them. To understand what happened on Valentine's Day 2018, we must first understand Nikolas Jacob Cruz. Born September 24, 1998 in Margate, Florida, he entered the world already damaged. His biological mother's drug and alcohol use during pregnancy left him with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, a condition that would affect his reasoning, impulse control, and behavior for life. His biological father's identity remains unknown. Nikolas spent his earliest days in an orphanage before being adopted by Roger and Linda Cruz, who also adopted his biological half-brother, Zachary. The Cruz family seemed stable, loving, but tragedy struck early. Roger Cruz died at age 67 in 2004, when Nikolas was just 5 years old. Linda became a single mother to 2 boys, one of whom was already showing signs of severe behavioral problems. The warning signs started in preschool. Teachers reported aggressive outbursts, inability to focus, and alarming behavioral issues. By the time Nikolas reached middle school, his records read like a horror movie script. He was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, and depression. He had a documented history of attempting suicide. He fantasized about guns and violence. He told peers he wanted to be a professional school shooter. The calls to law enforcement became a grim routine. From 2008 to 2017, police responded to the Cruz home at least 45 times. Some sources say more. The reasons varied: domestic disturbances, Nicholas threatening people, concerns about his mental state, reports of violence. In 2016, the Florida Department of Children and Families investigated him after he posted Snapchat images of his arms covered in self-inflicted cuts, saying he planned to buy a gun. A school resource officer suggested involuntary psychiatric evaluation under Florida's Baker Act. State investigators concluded he was at low risk of harming himself or others. They were catastrophically wrong. On September 24, 2017, Nicholas's 19th birthday, someone using the username Nicholas Cruz posted a comment on a YouTube video, "I'm going to be a professional school shooter." The YouTube creator Ben Bennett from Mississippi immediately reported the comment to the FBI. The Bureau investigated but couldn't identify the person behind the account. The trail went cold. 2 months later, on November 1, 2017, Linda Cruz died of pneumonia at age 68. At 19, Nicholas was fully orphaned. He bounced between relatives' homes and friends' couches, untethered and increasingly unstable. The family who took him in reported finding his AR-15 rifle, but didn't secure it or alert authorities about the danger brewing in their guest room. On November 30, 2017, the FBI received another tip, this one even more explicit. A caller, later identified as a family friend, warned that Nicholas could be a school shooter in the making. The caller reported that he had posted photos on Instagram showing guns and dead animals, that he wanted to kill people, and that he had the mental capacity of a 12 to 14-year-old. The FBI took the information but never forwarded it to their Miami field office. The tip disappeared into bureaucratic void. February 5, 2016, police received an anonymous tip that Nicholas Cruz had threatened to shoot up the school. Nothing was done. The system, law enforcement, mental health services, schools, family, had countless opportunities to intervene. 45 police calls, FBI tips, school warnings, psychiatric evaluations. Each time, the system blinked. Each time, Nicholas Cruz slipped through the cracks. Until Valentine's Day, when those cracks swallowed 17 lives. Valentine's Day, 2018. 2:19 p.m. The Uber dropped Nicholas Cruz at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. He wore a burgundy shirt. He carried a black rifle case and a backpack loaded with magazines. A campus monitor spotted him walking purposefully toward Building 12, a 3-story structure housing freshman classrooms. The monitor radioed a colleague, but didn't stop him. Building 12 became a kill zone. Cruz entered through the east stairwell on the first floor. He pulled out his AR-15 style rifle, a Smith & Wesson M&P 15 semi-automatic that he'd legally purchased a year earlier. He had prepared meticulously. He knew the building's layout. He'd attended school here. These weren't strangers he was about to murder. They were former classmates, younger students he'd walked past in hallways, teachers who'd tried to help him. At 2:21 p.m., he fired his first shots. The attack began on the first floor in the freshman hallway. Students were in the final minutes of 7th period. Some were packing up. Others were focused on lessons, eager for the weekend ahead. When the gunfire erupted, many thought it was fireworks, a Valentine's Day prank. It wasn't. Nicholas Cruz moved methodically, firing into classrooms through the windows in the doors. Room 1216, room 1214. Students screamed. Teachers rushed to lock doors, but the shooter was faster. He fired through windows, killing and wounding students huddled against walls. Luke Hoyer, 15, was shot and killed in the hallway. Martin Duke, 14, died in his classroom. Gina Montalto, 14, was struck down as she tried to flee. Nicholas Dworet, 17, a swimming champion with a scholarship to the University of Indianapolis, was killed protecting classmates. Helena Ramsey, 17, died in her classroom, shot multiple times. Chris Hickson, the school's 49-year-old athletic director, heard the gunshots and ran toward the danger. He was a Navy veteran, a wrestling coach, a man who dedicated his life to students. He confronted the shooter in the hallway. Nicholas Cruz shot him down. Chris Hickson died a hero trying to stop a massacre. Aaron Feiss, 37, assistant football coach and security guard, also ran toward the gunfire. He used his body to shield students. Cruz shot him. Feiss died at the hospital hours later, still protecting his kids. On the first floor, Cruz also wounded multiple students who would survive with life-altering injuries and trauma. Then he moved to the second floor. Cruz climbed the stairs, his rifle loaded with fresh magazines. He fired randomly into classrooms. Students dove under desks. Teachers barricaded doors with their own bodies. On the third floor, the carnage intensified. Room 1214 became a bloodbath. Students were trapped. The shooter fired through the door's window, shooting blindly into the classroom. When he couldn't get in, he moved to the next room. In room 12 and 16, geography teacher Scott Bagel, 35, heard the shooting and rushed to lock his classroom door. He held the door open to allow students from the hallway to rush inside to safety. As he ushered the last students through, Nicholas Cruz appeared. Bagel pushed the final student inside and tried to close the door. Cruz shot him in the chest. Scott Bagel collapsed in the doorway. He died, saving his students. His final act was opening that door, choosing to risk his life so teenagers could live theirs. Kara Logren, 14, was killed on the third floor. Luke Hoyer, 15, died in the hallway. Joaquin Oliver, 17, called Guac by friends, was shot and killed. His girlfriend would later say, "I wish that you met Joaquin because he would have been your friend. He would have extended a hand to you. He would have loved you." Carmen Schentrup, 16, a National Merit Scholar semifinalist, was shot in the hallway and killed instantly. Elena Petty, 14, a volunteer with a Helping Hands program, died on the first floor. Meadow Pollock, 18, was shot 4 times in the hallway. She was college-bound, vibrant, loved. Alex Schachter, 14, who played trombone in the marching band, was killed. Alyssa Alhada, 14, captain of the Parkland Travel Soccer Club, was murdered in her classroom. Jamie Guttenberg, 14, died on the second floor. Her father, Fred, would later become one of the most vocal advocates for gun reform. Peter Wang, 15, a member of the Junior Reserve Officers Training Corps, JROTC, was last seen in his JROTC uniform holding doors open so other students could escape. He didn't make it out himself. Cruz shot him down as he held the door. Peter Wang was posthumously admitted to the United States Military Academy at West Point. He was buried in his JROTC Blues uniform, a hero at 15. In total, the attack lasted approximately 6 minutes. Cruz fired over 100 rounds. 17 people died. 17 more were wounded. The injuries ranged from gunshot wounds requiring extensive surgeries to psychological trauma that would haunt survivors for life. Then, as quickly as it began, Nicholas Cruz stopped shooting. At 2:27 p.m., approximately 6 minutes after the shooting began, Nicholas Cruz made a calculated decision. He dropped his rifle and tactical vest in the third-floor stairwell. He blended in with the panicked students evacuating the building. Covered in the chaos of mass exodus, students running, crying, screaming, Cruz walked out of Building 12 and off campus. Nobody stopped him. He walked to a nearby Walmart, then to a McDonald's. He bought a drink, sat down, acted like nothing had happened. Surveillance footage shows him calm, casual, checking his phone. An hour and 20 minutes after the shooting began, around 3:40 p.m., A Coral Springs police officer spotted a young man matching the suspect's description walking down a residential street about 2 miles from the school. The officer approached. "Get on the ground." Nikolas Cruz complied without resistance. He was arrested, cuffed, and taken into custody. In the patrol car, he made incriminating statements. He told officers he heard demons in his head telling him to burn, kill, destroy. He admitted he'd done something bad. The investigation moved swiftly. In Cruz's backpack, investigators found additional ammunition magazines. On his phone, they found videos he'd recorded in the days before the massacre. Videos where he detailed his plan to be the next school shooter of 2018 and said he wanted to kill at least 20 people. He said he'd been planning this for years. The evidence was overwhelming. This wasn't a crime of passion or a psychotic break. It was premeditated murder, meticulously planned and ruthlessly executed. In the immediate aftermath, Parkland survivors did something unprecedented. Instead of retreating into grief, they rose up in rage. They refused to let their classmates' deaths be just another statistic in America's endless cycle of school shootings. Emma Gonzalez, a senior at Stoneman Douglas, gave a speech at a gun control rally 3 days after the shooting. Her words, "We call BS," became a rallying cry. Her speech went viral. She became the face of a movement. Alongside fellow survivors, David Hogg, Jacqueline Corin, Cameron Kasky, and others, Gonzalez co-founded Never Again MSD, a student-led organization demanding comprehensive gun control legislation. Their message was simple: enough is enough. 6 weeks after the shooting, on March 24, 2018, survivors organized the March for Our Lives, one of the largest youth-led demonstrations in American history. An estimated 800,000 people marched in Washington, D.C. Millions more participated in over 800 simultaneous marches worldwide. The Parkland students changed the conversation. They lobbied lawmakers, registered young voters, called out politicians who accepted NRA money, and refused to let adults dismiss them as crisis actors or naive children. They were teenagers who'd watched their friends die. They had moral authority. They used it. Their advocacy led to some tangible changes. Florida passed the Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School Public Safety Act, which raised the minimum age to purchase firearms to 21, established a red flag law allowing courts to temporarily remove guns from people deemed dangerous, and allocated funding for mental health services and school security. But the survivors wanted more. They wanted universal background checks. They wanted assault weapon bans. They wanted a country where children didn't have to practice active shooter drills. And they wanted justice for their dead classmates. Nikolas Cruz was charged with 17 counts of first-degree murder and 17 counts of attempted murder. He faced the death penalty. Florida is a capital punishment state, and prosecutors believe this case, premeditated mass murder of children, met every criteria for execution. Cruz's public defenders initially suggested an insanity defense but withdrew it. Instead, they offered a plea deal. Cruz would plead guilty to all charges in exchange for life in prison without parole. He would avoid trial. He would accept responsibility. Prosecutors rejected the deal. They wanted the death penalty. In October 2021, Cruz pleaded guilty to all 34 charges. But Florida law required a penalty phase trial where a jury would decide life in prison or death by lethal injection. The penalty phase began in July 2022, over 4 years after the massacre. It lasted 3 months. The jury heard gut-wrenching testimony from parents who'd buried their children, from teachers who'd watched students die, from survivors who still heard gunfire in their nightmares. They saw the surveillance footage of Cruz stalking through Building 12, methodically hunting victims. They heard the 911 calls, students whispering pleas for help, teachers begging for police to arrive faster. they learned that Cruz had returned to shoot wounded victims again, ensuring they died, that he'd shot through classroom door windows, firing blindly at teenagers, that he'd Googled best AR-15 modifications for mass shootings. The evidence was overwhelming. The cruelty was undeniable. But Cruz's defense team, led by death penalty specialists who'd worked 5,000-plus hours on the case, presented extensive mitigation evidence. They argued Cruz suffered from fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, that his brain was permanently damaged before birth. They brought in neuropsychologists who testified about his cognitive deficits. They detailed his mother's drug use, his traumatic childhood, his documented mental illnesses. Under Florida law at the time, a death sentence required a unanimous jury recommendation. All 12 jurors had to agree Cruz deserved execution. On October 13, 2022, after deliberating for one day, the jury returned with their recommendation: life without parole. 3 jurors, only 3, had voted against the death penalty. They cited mitigating circumstances, primarily Cruz's mental illness and fetal alcohol syndrome. 9 jurors wanted him dead, but 3 said no, and that was enough to spare his life. The courtroom erupted. Families of the victims couldn't believe it. Fred Guttenberg, father of 14-year-old Jaime, walked out of the courtroom in disgust. Later, he told reporters, "After 4.5 grueling years, a failed judicial system did not hand down a death sentence to the murderer of my daughter and 16 others. The system values this animal's life over the 17 now dead." Annika Dworet, mother of 17-year-old Nicholas Dworet, said through tears, "It is heartbreaking how any person who heard and saw all this did not give this killer the worst punishment possible." Lori Alhadeff, mother of 14-year-old Alyssa, confronted the jury's decision with raw emotion. "You robbed Alyssa of a lifetime of memories." Tony Montalto, father of 14-year-old Gina, said, "This should have been the death penalty 100%. The jurors' identities were protected, but their decision sparked a firestorm. How could anyone watch that trial, see the evidence, hear the testimonies, witness the premeditation, and not vote for death? Legal experts explained the jurors had followed the law. Under Florida statute, mitigating factors, like mental illness, must be weighed against aggravating factors, like premeditation and cruelty. 3 jurors believed the mitigation outweighed the aggravation. But for victims' families, that explanation felt like betrayal. One survivor, Samantha Fuentes, said at the formal sentencing, "I'll never take my anger, pain, and suffering out on others because I am stronger than you." But even she admitted, "I am angry about his sentence." On November 2, 2022, 2 weeks after the jury's recommendation, Circuit Judge Elizabeth Scherer formally sentenced Nicholas Cruz. By law, she had no choice but to follow the jury's recommendation. Cruz received 34 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole, 1 for each murder and attempted murder conviction. Judge Scherer also imposed $50,000 fines and $5,000 civil penalties for each death. Before imposing sentence, Judge Scherer allowed victims and families to address Cruz directly. Over 2 days, dozens of people confronted the man who'd destroyed their lives. Linda Beigel Schulman, mother of teacher Scott Beigel, refused to even say Cruz's name. She addressed him as the confessed, convicted Parkland mass murderer and said, "Your notoriety is over today." Cruz sat shackled in his red jumpsuit, expressionless. He never apologized. He never spoke. When given the chance to address the court, he declined. He showed no remorse. The sentencing brought some closure, but it also sparked immediate political action. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and state legislators were furious. They vowed to change the law that allowed 3 jurors to spare Cruz's life. In April 2023, Governor DeSantis signed legislation lowering the threshold for death sentences from unanimous juries to 8 of 12 votes. Florida became one of only 2 states, alongside Alabama, allowing non-unanimous death sentences. The law was nicknamed the Parkland Law, a direct response to what politicians framed as a miscarriage of justice. Civil rights advocates warned the change would lead to wrongful executions and disproportionately affect people of color. The U.S. Supreme Court had ruled in 2016, Hurst v. Florida, that Florida's previous non-unanimous death penalty law was unconstitutional. But the new law was designed to pass constitutional scrutiny with slightly different parameters. Whether it stands remains to be seen. But one thing is certain, the Parkland case changed Florida law. Nikolas Cruz's life, spared by 3 jurors, led to legislation making it easier to sentence future defendants to death. Nikolas Cruz, now 26, is incarcerated in a Florida state prison serving life without parole. He will never walk free. He will die behind bars. In June 2024, Cruz settled a civil lawsuit with shooting survivor Anthony Borges, who was shot 5 times. The settlement gave Borges legal rights to Cruz's name and story, meaning Cruz cannot profit from books, movies, or interviews without Borges's permission. It ensures the killer can never make money from his crimes. The families of the Parkland victims continue their advocacy. Some founded nonprofits. Others lobby for gun reform. Many speak at schools, warning students about the dangers of unchecked mental illness and easy access to weapons. The survivors, those who walked out of Building 12 that day, continue to live with trauma. Many suffer from PTSD, anxiety, depression. Some have flashbacks when they hear loud noises. Others struggle in crowded places, always looking for exits. But they also persist. They graduate college. They vote. They fight for change. Emma Gonzalez went to college and continues advocacy work. David Hogg attends Harvard. Cameron Kasky co-founded Compact, a community resource for Gen Z. The March for Our Lives organization continues lobbying for gun control legislation. The victims remain frozen at the ages they died. Peter Wang, 15, Jamie Guttenberg, 14, Carmen Schentrup, 16. Their families visit graves. They post tributes on birthdays that will never be celebrated. They live in a world where Valentine's Day is no longer a celebration of love, but a reminder of loss. The Parkland shooting raises questions America still hasn't answered. How many warning signs must we miss before we're complicit? 45 police calls, FBI tips, school suspensions, social media threats. At what point does falling through the cracks become willful negligence? Can mental illness excuse mass murder? Cruz's brain was damaged before birth. He had documented psychiatric disorders. He was a deeply troubled teenager. Does that mitigate his guilt? Or does premeditated murder transcend any diagnosis? Should juries be unanimous in death penalty cases? 3 jurors spared Cruz's life. 9 wanted him executed. In changing the law to allow 8 of 12 verdicts, did Florida protect public safety or open the door to wrongful executions? What do we owe the victims? Families wanted Cruz dead. The justice system gave him life. Who gets closure? Who gets justice? How do we stop the next one? Parkland wasn't the first school shooting. It won't be the last. The survivors marched. They lobbied. They voted. Some laws changed, but school shootings continue. These questions have no easy answers. February 14, 2018, Valentine's Day. A day that should have been about love. Instead, 17 people lost their lives to a young man who'd been failed by every system meant to help him, and who chose, despite that failure, to become a murderer. Nikolas Cruz is not a victim. He's a killer. He planned his crime. He executed it. He showed no mercy, but he's also a cautionary tale, proof that we, as a society, don't take warning signs seriously until it's too late. Proof that mental health systems are underfunded and ineffective. Proof that even when red flags wave frantically, bureaucracy and apathy let dangerous people slip through. The heroes of Parkland, Chris Hickson running toward gunfire, Scott Beigel holding the door open, Peter Wang in his JROTC uniform. They deserved a world where their sacrifice wasn't necessary. They deserved a system that caught Nikolas Cruz before he became a school shooter. They didn't get it. And neither did the 14 students and 3 staff members whose names we must never forget. Alyssa Alhadef, Scott Beigel, Martin Duke Anguiano, Nicholas Doret, Aaron Feiss, Jaime Guttenberg, Chris Hickson, Luke Hoyer, Kara Loughran, Gina Montalto, Joaquin Oliver, Elena Petty, Meadow Pollock, Helena Ramsey, Alex Schachter, Carmen Schentrup, Peter Wang. Say their names. Because the only way to honor them is to ensure the next Nikolas Cruz never gets the chance to pull the trigger. Case 3. Willard Miller and Jeremy Goodale. Nohema Graber loved her morning walks. Every day, without fail, the 66-year-old Spanish teacher would drive to Chautauqua Park in Fairfield, Iowa, a sprawling green space with winding trails, towering trees, and the peaceful solitude she cherished. She'd walk for an hour, sometimes more, clearing her mind before heading to Fairfield High School, where she'd taught Spanish since 2012. Her students knew about these walks. She'd mentioned them in class, how the fresh air helped her think, how nature calmed her spirit. Some students found it endearing, this ritual of a woman who'd traveled the world as a flight attendant and commercial pilot, before dedicating the second half of her life to teaching Iowa teenagers the language of her homeland. 2 of her students, honor students even, knew her routine better than most. Willard Miller, 16, was failing Spanish. Not just struggling, failing. And that F threatened everything he'd worked for, his academic record, his college prospects, and most importantly, his acceptance into a prestigious study abroad program he'd been planning for months. The bad grade stood between Willard and his dreams like an insurmountable wall. Jeremy Goodale, also 16, was Willard's best friend. He wasn't failing Spanish. He didn't need to kill anyone. But when Willard came to him with a plan, a way to solve the grade problem permanently, Jeremy didn't say no. He said yes. On November 2nd, 2021, these 2 teenagers didn't go to Chautauqua Park for a walk. They went with a baseball bat, a wheelbarrow, and a plan to commit murder. And when Nohema Graber arrived for her daily routine, they were waiting. What happened next is a case study in the banality of evil, how 2 seemingly normal, high-achieving American teenagers could murder a woman they knew, a teacher they'd sat across from in class, all because of a letter grade. It's a story about academic pressure twisted into something monstrous, about friendship corrupted into conspiracy, about a vibrant woman whose journey from Mexico to Iowa ended in a shallow grave covered by a tarp and a railroad tie. It's a story that asks the most disturbing question: if 2 honor students can coldly plan and execute murder over a bad grade, how safe are our teachers? How safe are any of us? To understand the magnitude of what was taken on November 2nd, 2021, you must first know who Nohema Graber was. She was born in Xalapa, Mexico, a vibrant city in the state of Veracruz, nestled in the mountains. Growing up in Mexico in the mid-20th century, Nohema was a dreamer. While other girls her age focused on traditional paths, Nohema looked up. Literally, she wanted to fly. After high school, she pursued that dream. She became a flight attendant, traveling the world, seeing countries and cultures most people only read about in books. But flying as a passenger wasn't enough. Nohema wanted to pilot the planes herself. In an era when female pilots were extraordinarily rare, especially female pilots from Mexico, Nohema earned her commercial airline pilot's license. She flew professionally, navigating massive aircraft through clouds and storms, responsible for hundreds of lives on every flight. She was a pioneer, a woman who refused to let gender or background limit her aspirations. Then she fell in love. Nohema married Paul Graber, and their relationship brought her to the United States. In 1992, they settled in Fairfield, Iowa, a small city of about 10,000 people, located 100 miles southeast of Des Moines. Fairfield was about as far from the skies and the excitement of international travel as you could get. It was quiet, rural, the kind of place where everybody knew everybody. But Nohema found purpose there. She decided to become a teacher. She earned her teaching certificate and in 2012 joined the faculty at Fairfield High School teaching Spanish. For Nohema, it was full circle. She could share her language, her culture, her heritage with young Americans who'd never been to Mexico, never tasted authentic food from Xalapa, never heard Spanish spoken with the passion of a native. Her students loved her. Not all of them. Teenagers rarely love all their teachers, but most. They described her as patient, enthusiastic, genuinely invested in their success. She didn't just teach vocabulary and verb conjugations. She taught them about Mexican culture, music, traditions. She wanted them to see the beauty in the language, not just memorize it for a test. Colleagues described her as dedicated. She stayed late to help struggling students. She organized cultural events. She genuinely cared. Her personal life, however, carried burdens. Her husband, Paul, had been disabled for over 20 years, suffering from extensive nerve damage in his feet and legs. Nohema was the primary breadwinner in the household, working tirelessly to support them both. Despite the challenges, she never complained. She showed up every day with a smile. To her family, Nohema was everything. Her son Christian adored her. Her extended family in Mexico stayed connected through phone calls and visits. She was the matriarch, the glue, the one who'd made it to America and never forgot where she came from. She was 66 years old when she died. Not old, but not young either. She should have had decades left, time to retire, travel again, spend time with grandchildren, enjoy the fruits of a life well lived. But two of her students had other plans. Willard Miller and Jeremy Goodale were not troubled teens from broken homes. They weren't loners with manifestos or histories of violence. They were, by all outward appearances, normal kids. Both were 16 years old, juniors at Fairfield High School. Both came from seemingly stable families. Both were involved in school activities. Willard was academically ambitious, the kind of student who planned years ahead, thinking about college, career, success. Jeremy was his loyal friend, the sidekick, the one who went along with Willard's plans. But something darker lurked beneath the surface. Willard Miller was failing Spanish class. For a high-achieving student with big plans, this was catastrophic. The bad grade threatened his GPA. More importantly, it jeopardized his acceptance into a study abroad program, an opportunity he'd been counting on, planning for, fantasizing about. The program was his ticket to adventure, to prestige, to proving himself, and Nohema Graber, kind, patient Mrs. Graber, was the obstacle. She'd given him the F. She'd ruined everything. Most students in this situation would beg for extra credit. They'd get a tutor, they'd accept the consequences, and work harder next semester. Willard Miller decided to kill her. It's unclear exactly when the plan formed, but evidence would later show that by mid-October 2021, weeks before the murder, the boys were already discussing it. They weren't joking, they weren't fantasizing, they were planning. Jeremy Goodale didn't have a failing grade. He had no personal beef with Mrs. Graber, but when Willard proposed the plan, Jeremy didn't walk away. He didn't tell an adult. He didn't try to talk his friend out of murder. He agreed to help. Prosecutors would later describe their relationship as co-conspirators, with Miller as the mastermind and Goodale as the willing accomplice. But Judge Sean Showers would make a critical distinction during sentencing. Willard Miller was far more sinister in his planning, while Jeremy Goodell showed more genuine remorse afterward. Both were guilty. Both would go to prison, but their culpability in the judge's eyes was not equal. Still, the question remains: how do two 16-year-olds, two boys who'd never been in serious trouble, go from sitting in Spanish class to plotting their teacher's murder? The answer is chilling in its simplicity. They decided her life mattered less than a letter grade. November 2nd, 2021, a Tuesday afternoon in Fairfield, Iowa. The temperature hovered in the low 50s, crisp but not cold, perfect for a walk. Nohema Graber finished her day at Fairfield High School and drove to Chautauqua Park, same as always. The park was quiet. The trees had mostly shed their leaves, leaving bare branches against a gray sky. The kind of autumn day that feels peaceful, melancholy. Nohema parked her van, a vehicle so distinctive that investigators would later use it as a key piece of evidence, and began her walk along the familiar trail. She had no reason to be afraid. This was Fairfield, Iowa, population 10,000, a place where violent crime was almost unheard of, a place where teachers could walk alone in parks without fear. But Willard Miller and Jeremy Goodell were waiting. They'd skipped the end of the school day, left campus, and gone to the park. They brought a baseball bat. They'd planned this for weeks, discussed how they'd do it, when, where. They knew Mrs. Graber's routine. They knew she walked alone. They knew no one would be around to help her. When Nohema appeared on the trail, they ambushed her. The attack was brutal. They beat her with the baseball bat, striking her head, her body over and over. Nohema, a 66-year-old woman, had no chance to fight back, no chance to run, no chance to scream for help that would arrive in time. She died there on the trail she'd walked hundreds of times, killed by students she'd tried to teach, murdered by boys young enough to be her grandchildren. But the horror didn't end with her death. Miller and Goodell had brought a wheelbarrow. They loaded Nohema's body into it and wheeled her deeper into the park, toward the railroad tracks that cut through the woods. They found a secluded spot. They dumped her body. Then they covered it with a tarp, placed a wheelbarrow on top, and added a railroad tie for good measure, crude attempts to conceal the corpse. Then they left. They walked out of Chautauqua Park. They went about their lives. They went home. They acted like nothing had happened. Nohema Graber had promised her family she'd be home for dinner. She never arrived. When Nohema didn't come home that evening, her family immediately knew something was wrong. Nohema was reliable. She always called if she'd be late. She'd made promises about dinner. She wouldn't just disappear. Her family contacted police. Officers began searching, starting with the places Nohema was known to frequent. Chautauqua Park was high on that list. Everyone knew about her daily walks. On November 3, 2021, the day after her murder, searchers found her van in the park's parking lot. The vehicle was locked, undamaged, but Nohema was nowhere to be found. That's when police knew they were dealing with something serious. Hundreds of volunteers joined the search. Law enforcement combed through the park. They followed trails, searched ravines, looked under bridges. The community rallied, teachers, students, neighbors, strangers, all desperate to find Nohema Graber. Later that day, they found her. Concealed under the tarp, wheelbarrow, and railroad tie, Nohema's body lay near the railroad tracks. The coroner would later determine she'd died from trauma to the head, blunt force injuries consistent with being beaten with a bat. The community was devastated. This was Fairfield, Iowa. Teachers didn't get murdered. Not here, not like this. But police quickly realized this wasn't a random attack. The concealment of the body suggested the killer knew the victim, knew the park, knew they had time. This was planned. And social media would lead them straight to the killers. In the age of social media, criminals rarely stay silent. Jeremy Goodale certainly didn't. Within days of the murder, Goodale was messaging friends on social media. He didn't explicitly confess, but he said enough. He made cryptic statements. He hinted at involvement. He shared details that only someone present at the murder could know. Friends who received these messages were disturbed. Some dismissed it as dark humor. Teenagers say stupid things online all the time, but others felt uneasy. When news broke about Mrs. Graber's murder, those messages took on sinister meaning. Someone reported the messages to police. Investigators obtained warrants for Goodale's and Miller's phones and social media accounts. What they found was damning, planning conversations, messages between Miller and Goodale discussing the plan. In the weeks leading up to November 2nd, post-murder communications, Goodale telling friends he'd done something bad. Location data. Both boys' phones pinged near Chautauqua Park at the time of the murder. Search history. Disturbing Google searches on Miller's phone about how to dispose of bodies and avoid detection. On November 4th, 2021, just 2 days after the murder, police arrested both Willard Miller and Jeremy Goodale. They were charged as adults with first-degree murder. During interrogations, the boys' stories diverged. Miller initially denied everything, then later admitted involvement but claimed he didn't strike the fatal blows. Goodale was more forthcoming. He admitted they'd planned it together, that both had participated in the attack, and that Miller had initiated the plan because of the failing grade. The evidence was overwhelming. The social media posts, the location data, the forensic evidence tying them to the scene. Both boys had been caught almost immediately, their digital footprints leading investigators directly to them. There would be no mystery, no unsolved case, just two teenage boys sitting in jail cells facing the reality of what they'd done. Willard Miller and Jeremy Goodale were charged as adults with first-degree murder, the most serious charge in Iowa's criminal code. In Iowa, first-degree murder typically carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison without parole. But there was a complication. Both defendants were 16 years old at the time of the crime. Under Iowa law, juveniles cannot be sentenced to mandatory life without parole. The U.S. Supreme Court had ruled in Miller v. Alabama, 2012, that mandatory life sentences for juveniles violate the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. This meant the boys would face life sentences, but with the possibility of parole after serving a minimum number of years. Initially, both boys pleaded not guilty. Their defense attorneys explored options, claiming the killing wasn't premeditated, arguing for lesser charges, negotiating plea deals. But the evidence was too strong. The planning was too well documented. In April 2023, nearly 2 years after the murder, both defendants changed their pleas to guilty. They admitted to first-degree murder. They acknowledged beating Nohema Graber to death. Willard Miller was sentenced first in July 2023. Judge Sean Showers presided over Miller's sentencing hearing. The courtroom was packed with Graber's family, community members, and media. The victim impact statements were devastating. Tom Graber, Nohema's brother-in-law, spoke about how the murder had hastened Paul Graber's death. Paul, Nohema's disabled husband who depended on her for everything, had been diagnosed with cancer. The family believes the grief and stress of losing Nohema accelerated his decline. Paul died not long after his wife, leaving their son Christian orphaned by violence and disease. Murdering a teacher to avoid an F, Tom Graber said, his voice breaking. That was apparently enough for you to go along with this crime. Christian Graber, Nohema's son, also spoke. In a remarkable display of grace, he said he was willing to forgive Miller, not because Miller deserved it, but because Christian believed that's what his mother would want. I have hope that your story can still be something positive, Christian told Miller. Every day I wake up and try to do something positive. I don't do it for me, I do it for Kendrick. I promise to live my life as a new person. But forgiveness didn't mean leniency. Judge Showers noted that Miller had been far more sinister in his planning than Goodale. Miller had initiated the murder plot. Miller had the motive, the failing grade. Miller had recruited Goodale to help. The judge described Miller's actions as premeditated, calculated, and devoid of genuine remorse. Willard Miller, then 17, stood in the courtroom wearing orange jail scrubs. He showed little emotion as Judge Showers delivered the sentence, life in prison with the possibility of parole after 35 years. Miller would have to serve at least 35 years behind bars before even being eligible for parole. He'd be 51 years old, more than 3 times his current age, before he could even ask to be released. And parole isn't guaranteed. He might serve the full life sentence. Miller was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. He never looked at Graber's family. He never apologized to them directly. His only statement had come earlier, during the hearing, when he read a prepared apology that rang hollow to those who'd lost Nohema. "I'm sincerely sorry for the distress that I've caused you," Miller said. "What I did was wrong, and I accept responsibility for my carelessness, for my ignorance." Carelessness? Ignorance. Words that seemed absurdly inadequate for premeditated murder. 4 months later, in November 2023, Jeremy Goodale stood before Judge Showers for his own sentencing hearing. The contrast between Goodale and Miller was stark. While Miller had shown little emotion and deflected responsibility, Goodale openly sobbed. He apologized repeatedly. He addressed Graber's family directly. "I am immensely ashamed of myself," Goodale said through tears. "I let my jealousy get the better of me. I'm sorry for all the unkind things I said about you. I am sorry, Phoebe." Wait, Phoebe? He'd misspoken clearly, emotional and disoriented. He meant Nohema. The apology was clumsy, imperfect, but it seemed genuine. Goodale's defense attorney emphasized that his client had shown remorse from the beginning. Unlike Miller, Goodale had admitted his role to police almost immediately. He'd agreed to testify against Miller if the case went to trial. It didn't, because both pleaded guilty. He acknowledged that he'd made a terrible, irreversible choice. Judge Showers noted these differences. "Unlike your co-defendant, it's clear to me you have regretted your role in Ms. Graber's murder," Showers told Goodale. "I think time will tell, but you're far more likely to be successful than Mr. Miller." Still, Goodale had participated in a brutal murder. He'd beaten a 66-year-old woman to death. He'd helped cover up the crime. Remorse didn't erase what he'd done. Judge Showers sentenced Jeremy Goodale to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Goodale would be 41 years old when eligible for parole, younger than Miller, reflecting the judge's belief that Goodale was the follower, not the leader, and showed greater capacity for rehabilitation. Both boys were taken to separate Iowa prisons. Willard Miller went to Iowa State Penitentiary. Jeremy Goodale to Anamosa State Penitentiary. They would serve their sentences apart, 2 teenagers who'd destroyed lives, Nohema's, their own, their families, the communities, over a grade. The Fairfield community struggled to process what had happened. This wasn't a big city where violence, while tragic, is somewhat expected. This was a small Iowa town where people left doors unlocked and kids rode bikes without supervision. Teachers at Fairfield High School felt betrayed and terrified. If Nohema Graber, beloved, kind, dedicated, could be murdered by her own students over a grade, then no teacher was safe. What message did this send? That students could kill you if you didn't pass them? The school implemented new security measures. Teachers were advised not to walk alone in isolated areas. Some teachers began carrying pepper spray. The innocence of a small-town school was shattered. Nohema's family established a scholarship in her honor, the Nohema Graber Memorial Scholarship, which provides financial support to students pursuing careers in education. It's a bittersweet legacy, helping future teachers while mourning one who was killed by her students. Christian Graber, who'd already lost his mother, then lost his father Paul to cancer. The family believes Paul died of a broken heart, that the grief of losing Nohema, combined with his existing health problems, was simply too much. Christian was left alone, both parents taken within months of each other. The case drew national attention. News outlets descended on Fairfield. Commentators debated what the case revealed about American education, about academic pressure, about teenagers and violence. Some blamed the parents. Where were they? Others blamed the culture of achievement at all costs. Still others argued this was simply evil, inexplicable, and irreducible to sociological factors. But everyone agreed, Nohema Graber deserved better. She'd come to America chasing dreams. She'd worked as a flight attendant, earned her pilot's license, broken barriers. Then she dedicated the last decade of her life to teaching Spanish to Iowa kids who might never see Mexico, might never speak Spanish fluently, but might at least appreciate the beauty of another culture. And 2 of those kids killed her. The Willard Miller and Jeremy Goodale case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. Was this really about a grade? Miller claimed the failing mark would ruin his study abroad plans. But is that motive enough for murder? Thousands of students fail classes every year. They don't kill their teachers. So why did Miller? Some experts argue the case reflects toxic academic pressure, that we've created a culture where students feel their entire future hinges on every test, every grade, every achievement. One F becomes catastrophic. Success becomes identity. And when that identity is threatened, some students snap. But others reject this explanation entirely. They argue Miller and Goodale were simply bad kids who made a monstrous choice. Plenty of students face academic pressure. They don't plan murders for weeks, stalk their teachers, and beat them to death with baseball bats. Were these boys psychopaths? Neither had prior criminal records. Neither had been diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, but the level of premeditation, the coldness of the execution, and Miller's apparent lack of remorse suggest something deeply broken. Judge Showers seemed to recognize this distinction. He gave Goodale a shorter minimum sentence, suggesting he believed Goodale could be rehabilitated. But Miller? The judge saw something darker there, something sinister, that made a 35-year minimum necessary. What about the parents? Where were Miller's and Goodale's parents in all this? Did they miss warning signs? Were there warning signs to miss? The record is murky. Neither boy had a history of violence, neither had exhibited obvious red flags. They were honor students, involved in school. Their families seemed normal. This is perhaps the most terrifying aspect. These boys weren't obviously troubled. They weren't loners who wrote manifestos. They were just kids, normal Iowa teenagers who happened to decide that murder was preferable to a bad grade. Willard Miller, now 19, is incarcerated at Iowa State Penitentiary in Fort Madison, Iowa. He won't be eligible for parole until 2056, when he's 51 years old. He's serving his sentence in an adult facility, no longer a juvenile. His days are spent in a cell, surrounded by men decades older, all serving time for crimes ranging from robbery to murder. He has decades to think about what he did, decades to reflect on whether avoiding an F was worth spending his life in prison, whether killing Nohema Graber was worth never having a study abroad program, never going to college, never having a career, a family, a life. Jeremy Goodale, also 19, is at Anamosa State Penitentiary in Anamosa, Iowa. He'll be eligible for parole in 2046 at age 41. That's still more than 2 decades away. He'll be middle-aged before he even gets a chance at freedom. Goodale has reportedly been a model prisoner, participating in educational programs, expressing remorse, trying to become the person Judge Showers suggested he could be. Whether that will matter when the parole board reviews his case in 2046 remains to be seen. Nohema Graber is buried in Fairfield. Her grave is visited regularly by family, former students, and community members who never forgot her. Every year on her birthday, people leave flowers. On Dia de los Muertos, traditional Mexican offerings appear: marigolds, sugar skulls, photographs. Her son Christian continues to honor her memory. The scholarship bearing her name has already helped several students pursue teaching degrees. In a sense, Nohema's legacy continues. She's still teaching, still inspiring, still helping students achieve their dreams. Just not the two who killed her. The murder of Nohema Graber should have been a wake-up call. It should have sparked national conversations about teacher safety. How do we protect educators from students? Academic pressure. Are we pushing kids so hard that some break? Warning signs. How do we identify students capable of violence before they act? Juvenile justice. Should 16-year-olds who commit premeditated murder ever be eligible for parole? But like so many tragedies, the conversation faded. The news cycle moved on. Fairfield, Iowa, returned to being a quiet town that most Americans couldn't find on a map. Nohema Graber's murder changed nothing except for the people who loved her, who now live with a permanent hole in their lives. Teachers still give failing grades because that's their job. Students still face academic pressure because that's how the system works. And somewhere, another teenager is probably planning something terrible while the adults around them miss the signs. There's a photograph of Nohema Graber that circulated after her death. She's smiling, wearing a colorful blouse, her eyes bright with intelligence and warmth. She looks like what she was, a woman who'd lived an extraordinary life and found joy in teaching. When Willard Miller and Jeremy Goodale looked at Nohema Graber, they didn't see that woman. They didn't see someone's mother, someone's wife, someone who'd flown planes and traveled the world and chosen to spend her final years helping Iowa teenagers learn Spanish. They saw an obstacle, a grade on a transcript, a problem to be eliminated. That's the most chilling part of this case. Not the brutality of the murder itself, though that's horrible enough, but the casual dehumanization, the ability of two 16-year-olds to reduce a human life to an inconvenience. Nohema Graber spent her life teaching students to see beyond themselves, to appreciate other cultures, other languages, other perspectives. She tried to broaden their worldview. In the end, two of her students' worldviews were so narrow, so self-centered, so devoid of empathy that they saw her death as preferable to a failing grade. She taught them Spanish. She taught them about Mexico. She taught them about grammar and culture and conjugation. She never got the chance to teach them the most important lesson of all, that every human life has value, that grades don't matter more than people, that murder is not a solution to academic failure. By the time they learned those lessons, if they've learned them at all, it was far too late. Nohema Graber deserved to grow old. She deserved to retire, to travel, to spend time with family. She deserved to see students succeed, to attend their graduations, to receive thank you cards from kids who finally understood why learning Spanish mattered. She deserved better than being beaten to death in a park by teenagers worried about their GPAs. We all do. Case 4. Philip Chisholm. Colleen Ritzer believed in staying late. While other teachers at Danvers High School rushed out when the final bell rang, eager to start their evenings, Colleen remained in her classroom, room 301B, a modest math classroom with posters of geometric formulas, inspirational quotes about perseverance, and photographs of smiling students. She stayed because students needed help, because a struggling sophomore didn't understand algebra, because a shy freshman was too embarrassed to ask questions during class. Because that's what good teachers do. They give more than required, stay longer than asked, care deeper than expected. On October 22, 2013, Colleen Ritzer stayed late one last time. At 24 years old, she was in only her second year of teaching. Fresh out of Assumption College, she dreamed of becoming an educator since childhood. Her friends described her as living a life of quiet heroism. No grand gestures or public accolades, just daily acts of kindness and dedication. She tutored students for free. She answered emails at midnight. She made math, dreaded, anxiety-inducing math, feel approachable, even fun. Her students loved her. One had recently written in her memory jar a collection of notes students left thanking her. "You make me feel like I can do anything." On that Tuesday evening in October, as autumn darkness fell over the North Shore of Massachusetts, Colleen was helping a student with homework. Other teachers had left. The hallways were mostly empty, just scattered students finishing after-school activities, custodians cleaning classrooms, and one 14-year-old boy who'd been watching Colleen all day. His name was Philip Chisholm. He was new to Danvers High, a lanky freshman who'd just moved from Tennessee. Quiet, polite. The kind of kid teachers barely noticed because he didn't cause trouble. But that day, something had shifted in Philip's mind. Maybe it was a word Colleen said during class. Maybe it was something entirely internal, a psychotic break no one could have predicted. His lawyers would later argue he'd been hearing voices, experiencing delusions, suffering from a severe mental illness that robbed him of reason. Or maybe, as prosecutors would argue, Philip Chisholm was simply a calculating predator who saw opportunity and took it. Around 3:00 p.m., when most students had left for the day, Philip Chisholm followed Colleen Ritzer into a second-floor bathroom. What happened next was so brutal, so calculated, so grotesque that even veteran detectives who'd worked homicides for decades struggled to comprehend it. Philip Chisholm didn't just kill Colleen Ritzer. He strangled her. He stabbed her 16 times with a box cutter. He raped her. He violated her corpse. He stole her underwear and credit cards as trophies. Then he calmly placed her body in a large recycling barrel, wheeled it through the school's hallways, and dumped her in the woods behind the building like she was trash. When police found Colleen's body the next day, covered in leaves in a wooded area near the school, the community of Danvers, a quiet suburb north of Boston, was shattered. Teachers didn't get murdered at school. Not here, not by their own students, not like this. But they did. And she was. And the 14-year-old boy who did it would spend the next decade fighting to overturn his conviction, claiming mental illness made him not responsible for a crime that prosecutors called one of the most heinous acts of violence they'd ever encountered. This is the story of Philip Chisholm and Colleen Ritzer. It's a story that asks the most uncomfortable question in criminal justice. When does mental illness excuse murder? And if a teenager commits unspeakable evil, can he ever be anything other than a monster? To understand what was taken on October 22, 2013, you must first understand who Colleen Ritzer was. Born May 13, 1989 in Andover, Massachusetts, Colleen grew up in a loving, stable family. Her parents, Peggy and Tom Ritzer, raised Colleen and her siblings with strong values. Work hard, treat people with kindness, make the world better than you found it. Colleen embodied those values. In high school, she was the girl everyone liked, not because she was popular in the shallow sense, but because she was genuinely kind. She volunteered. She helped classmates who struggled. She smiled at people in the hallways. The little things that most teenagers don't bother with, Colleen did naturally. She attended Assumption College in Worcester, Massachusetts, majoring in mathematics and minoring in psychology. Her professors remembered her as dedicated, enthusiastic, always willing to go the extra mile. She wasn't the flashiest student, but she was reliable, solid, the kind of person you wanted on your team. After graduation, Colleen pursued her dream, teaching. She wanted to work with teenagers because she remembered how hard high school could be, the insecurity, the pressure, the feeling that nobody understood. Colleen wanted to be the teacher who understood, who made students feel seen, valued, capable. In 2012, she was hired by Danvers High School to teach mathematics. It was her dream job, close to home, a good school, students who needed her. She threw herself into the work with characteristic passion. Her teaching style was patient and encouraging. She didn't make students feel stupid when they didn't understand. She broke down problems step by step. She stayed after class to help. She created a classroom environment where struggling with math wasn't shameful. It was just part of learning. Her colleague, another math teacher, later said, "Colleen was the kind of teacher we all aspire to be. She genuinely cared about every single student." Outside of school, Colleen was equally vibrant. She had a boyfriend. She was close with her family. She loved to travel, experience new things, laugh with friends. She kept a memory jar where she'd save little notes, ticket stubs from concerts, photos from trips, messages from students thanking her. She believed in capturing joy, preserving it, reminding herself of what mattered. At 24, Colleen was just beginning her life. She had decades ahead of her, promotions, marriage probably, children of her own, years of shaping young minds, helping students find confidence in themselves, making a difference in ways big and small. She should have had all of that. Instead, she had one more day, one more student who needed help, one more reason to stay late at school, one more act of kindness that would cost her everything. Philip Chisholm was born in 1999 in Clarksville, Tennessee, a mid-sized city near the Kentucky border, home to Fort Campbell Military Base. His early childhood appeared normal. He lived with his mother Diana and attended local schools. Friends and teachers described him as quiet but not troubling. He played soccer. He made decent grades. Nothing about young Philip Chisholm suggested violence, but beneath the surface, his family life was fracturing. Philip's parents' marriage was troubled. His father had issues, though the details remained sealed in court records. The family dynamic was unstable. In 2013, when Philip was 14, his mother made a decision. They were leaving Tennessee. They were moving to Massachusetts to start fresh, away from Philip's father, away from the problems. For Diana Chisholm, it was a chance at a new beginning. For Philip, it was traumatic upheaval. He left behind friends, his school, his soccer team, everything familiar. In the summer of 2013, he and his mother relocated to Danvers, Massachusetts, a suburb about 20 miles north of Boston. Philip enrolled at Danvers High School as a freshman. He was the new kid, tall, thin, awkward. He didn't have friends. He kept to himself. Teachers barely noticed him because he didn't cause problems. He wasn't disruptive. He completed his work. He was just there. But according to defense psychiatrists who would later examine him, Philip was falling apart internally. Dr. Richard Dudley, Jr., a psychiatrist who evaluated Chisholm, would testify that Philip suffered from psychosis, a severe mental illness characterized by delusions and hallucinations. The doctor claimed Philip was hearing voices, that he was experiencing a mental break from reality, that the stress of moving, combined with underlying psychiatric issues, had pushed him over the edge into a psychotic episode. The defense would argue that on October 22, 2013, Philip Chisholm was not in control of his actions. He was in the throes of psychosis, unable to distinguish right from wrong, controlled by forces beyond his understanding. But prosecutors would paint a very different picture. They would argue that Philip Chisholm was calculating, methodical, and fully aware of what he was doing, that he brought a box cutter and gloves to school, that he followed Colleen Ritzer deliberately, that he raped her, murdered her, and disposed of her body with such cold precision that it revealed not insanity, but depravity. The question of what was happening inside Philip Chisholm's mind on October 22, 2013, would become the central battle of his trial. Was he a mentally ill child who lost control, or was he a sexual predator who saw an opportunity and took it? The answer would determine whether he deserved mercy or life in prison. The day began ordinarily. Students filed into Danvers High School on a Tuesday morning. Classes proceeded as usual. Colleen Ritzer taught her algebra and geometry classes. Philip Chisholm attended his classes, including Colleen's. But at some point during the day, the exact moment remains unclear, something changed. According to witness testimony and evidence presented at trial, Philip became fixated on Colleen. He watched her during class. He stayed behind when other students left. He was waiting. School ended at 2:00 p.m. Most students left immediately, eager to start their afternoon, but Colleen stayed in her classroom, as she often did, available for students who needed extra help. Around 3:00 p.m., security cameras captured Philip Chisholm entering the second-floor bathroom. Minutes later, Colleen Ritzer entered the same bathroom. What happened next was not captured on camera, but the forensic evidence told the story. Philip Chisholm attacked Colleen Ritzer in that bathroom. He strangled her. She fought back. There were defensive wounds on her hands, indicating she tried to protect herself. But Philip was bigger, stronger, and determined. He overpowered her. Once she was unconscious or subdued, he took out a box cutter, a tool he'd brought from home, and stabbed her 16 times. In the chest, neck, and torso. The medical examiner would later testify that any one of several wounds could have been fatal. Philip didn't stab her once in a frenzy. He stabbed her over and over, methodically ensuring she was dead. Then he raped her. The sexual assault was confirmed through forensic evidence. Philip Chisholm violated his teacher, a woman who'd shown him nothing but kindness, as she lay dying or already dead. After the rape, Philip went through Colleen's belongings. He took her credit cards. He took her driver's license. He took her underwear, a trophy, prosecutors would later argue, of his conquest. Then came the disposal of the body, an act so calculated that it would become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case against claims of insanity. Philip found a large recycling barrel in the school, one of the blue bins used to collect paper and plastic. He placed Colleen's body inside the barrel. Then he calmly wheeled it through the hallways of Danvers High School, out a back door across the soccer field, and into the woods behind the school. Security footage captured him pushing the recycling barrel. He wasn't running. He wasn't panicking. He was calm, methodical, like someone taking out the trash. In the dim woods, Philip dumped Colleen's body in a shallow area and covered it with leaves. He left the barrel nearby. Then he walked away. By 3:30 p.m., Colleen Ritzer was dead, discarded in the woods like garbage, and Philip Chisholm was walking through Danvers as if nothing had happened. When Colleen Ritzer didn't come home that evening, her family immediately knew something was wrong. Colleen was reliable. She always called if she'd be late. She never just disappeared. Her parents called the school. They called friends. By late evening, they called police. At the same time, Danvers High School staff realized Colleen's car was still in the parking lot. Her purse was still in her classroom, but Colleen was gone. Police began searching the school. They reviewed security footage. What they saw chilled them. Video showed Philip Chisholm wearing gloves and a hood, wheeling a large recycling barrel through the hallways around 3:30 p.m. Later footage showed him leaving the school grounds on foot. Meanwhile, Philip's mother, Diana, reported her son missing. He hadn't come home. She had no idea where he was. A massive search began. Police combed through the school, checked the surrounding area, tried to piece together what had happened. They knew Colleen was missing. They knew Philip had been seen with the recycling barrel. They suspected the worst. Around 12:30 a.m. on October 23rd, roughly 9 hours after the murder, police spotted Philip Chisholm walking along Route 1 in Topsfield, a town adjacent to Danvers. He was alone, on foot, miles from home. Officers approached him. Philip didn't run. He complied when they stopped him. "What are you doing out here?" an officer asked. "I'm watching a movie," Philip said. A bizarre, nonsensical answer. Police noticed blood on Philip's clothes. They saw scratches on his hands. They arrested him on suspicion of involvement in Colleen Ritzer's disappearance. At the station, detectives questioned him. Philip initially refused to talk, but eventually he made statements that were chilling in their matter-of-fact tone. He admitted he'd been in the bathroom with a teacher. He said something happened. He described disposing of a body. He led police to the woods behind Danvers High School at approximately 3:00 a.m. On October 23rd, officers found Colleen Ritzer's body. She was in a shallow depression, covered with leaves, her face brutalized, her clothes torn. The medical examiner would later determine she'd been dead for approximately 12 hours. The autopsy revealed the full horror: manual strangulation, 16 stab wounds, blunt force trauma, sexual assault. Colleen had suffered unimaginable violence in her final moments, and the 14-year-old boy who'd done it was sitting in a police interrogation room, calmly answering questions like he'd been caught shoplifting, not committing murder. Philip Chisholm was charged as a youthful offender, a category in Massachusetts law that allows juveniles aged 14 to 17 who commit serious crimes to be prosecuted in adult court, but with certain protections. He faced charges of first-degree murder, aggravated rape, and armed robbery. His defense team was led by veteran public defender Denise Regan. Their strategy was clear from the beginning. Philip Chisholm was mentally ill. He'd suffered a psychotic break. He wasn't criminally responsible for his actions. The defense brought in Dr. Richard Dudley, Jr., a psychiatrist who interviewed Philip extensively. Dr. Dudley testified that Philip exhibited signs of psychosis, including auditory hallucinations, hearing voices telling him to do things, delusions, believing he was being controlled by external forces, dissociation, feeling disconnected from reality during the attack. Dr. Dudley claimed that Philip's recent move from Tennessee had been deeply traumatic. Combined with family instability and possible underlying mental illness, Philip had experienced a complete break from reality on October 22nd. The defense argued Philip didn't remember large portions of the attack, that he was in a fugue state, acting on impulses he didn't understand and couldn't control, that a 14-year-old with severe mental illness shouldn't be held fully accountable for actions committed during psychosis. But prosecutors Mark Zanini and Kate McDougall presented a devastating counter-narrative. They argued that Philip Chisholm's actions were far too calculated to be the product of psychosis. Consider the evidence. He brought a box cutter and gloves from home. This suggested premeditation. He waited until the school was mostly empty. This suggested planning. He followed Colleen into a bathroom where they'd be alone. This suggested opportunity-seeking. He cleaned up the crime scene, removing evidence. This suggested consciousness of guilt. He wheeled her body through the school calmly, without panic. This suggested rational thought. He stole her credit cards and tried to use them later. This suggested awareness of value and utility. He disposed of the body in a way designed to conceal the crime. This suggested cover-up. Most damning, security footage showed Philip changing his clothes after the murder, stuffing his bloody clothes into his backpack. Psychotic individuals in the throes of delusions don't methodically change clothes to avoid detection. Prosecutors also noted that Philip never exhibited symptoms of psychosis before October 22nd or after his arrest. No teachers reported bizarre behavior. No students noticed him talking to himself or responding to voices. He functioned normally before the murder and after. The only time he supposedly lost touch with reality was during the exact window when he raped and murdered his teacher. That, prosecutors argued, was too convenient to be credible. The prosecution's theory, Philip Chisholm was a sexually motivated offender. He'd been fixated on Colleen Ritzer. When opportunity arose, an isolated bathroom, an empty school, he acted on his violent fantasies. The attack was predatory, not psychotic. Philip Chisholm's trial began in October 2015, nearly 2 years after Colleen's murder. The courtroom was packed with media, victims' family members, and a community desperate for justice. The evidence presented was overwhelming and horrific. Jurors saw crime scene photos showing Colleen's brutalized body, security footage of Philip wheeling the recycling barrel, forensic evidence linking Philip's DNA to the sexual assault, Philip's statements to police describing the disposal of the body, the stolen credit cards, and underwear found in Philip's possession. Colleen's family sat through every day of testimony, reliving the nightmare. Peggy Ritzer, Colleen's mother, would later describe the trial as almost unbearable, hearing in clinical detail how her daughter died, seeing photographs that no mother should ever see. The defense called Dr. Dudley and other experts who testified about Philip's mental state. They painted a picture of a deeply troubled teenager, failed by the mental health system, suffering from an illness he couldn't control. But on cross-examination, prosecutors dismantled the insanity defense. They pointed out inconsistencies in Philip's story. They highlighted how his actions demonstrated planning and awareness. They asked the jury, if he was truly psychotic, why did he try to hide the crime? On December 15, 2015, after several days of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of aggravated rape, guilty of armed robbery. The jury had rejected the insanity defense. They'd concluded that Philip Chisholm knew what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. Philip showed no emotion when the verdict was read. He sat silently, expressionless, as he had throughout the trial. Colleen's family wept with relief. It wasn't joy, nothing about this brought joy, but it was validation that their daughter's killer would be held accountable. On February 26, 2016, Philip Chisholm returned to Salem Superior Court for sentencing. Under Massachusetts law, juveniles convicted of first-degree murder cannot receive mandatory life without parole. The judge had discretion to impose a sentence ranging from 15 years to life, with parole eligibility determined by the court. Before Judge David Lowy imposed sentence, Colleen's family was given the opportunity to address the court. Peggy Ritzer, Colleen's mother, spoke first. Her voice trembled as she described the daughter she'd lost. "Colleen matters," she said. "Colleen was a caring and loving young woman, full of life and a beloved teacher." She described how Colleen's death had left her so very broken. "Now I isolate myself from people I love because pretending to be happy is so difficult," Peggy said. She told the court that Philip Chisholm was pure evil and that pure evil can never be rehabilitated. She asked for a sentence of death, impossible under Massachusetts law, which abolished capital punishment in 1984, but made clear she wanted the harshest penalty available. Tom Ritzer, Colleen's father, spoke about how he felt he'd failed his daughter. "I didn't protect Colleen," he said, his voice breaking. "A dad's job is to fix things. I would do anything I could if I could fix this for Colleen." Dan Ritzer, Colleen's brother, called Philip an animal and begged the judge to put this animal behind bars for as long as possible. 9 family members and friends spoke in total, each describing the ripple effects of Colleen's murder. How it had destroyed their ability to feel safe, how holidays were now reminders of absence, how they'd never recover from the loss. Judge Lowy listened to every word. Then he addressed Philip Chisholm directly. "The crashing waves of this tragedy will never wane," Judge Lowy said. He noted that Philip had shown no remorse, no empathy, no acknowledgement of what he'd done to Colleen and her family. Judge Lowy imposed sentence, 25 years to life for first-degree murder, 40 years to life for aggravated rape and armed robbery, to run concurrently. Because the sentences ran concurrently, Philip would be eligible for parole after 40 years when he's 54 years old. But parole isn't automatic. It's a privilege granted only if the parole board determines the inmate has been rehabilitated. Given the nature of Philip's crimes, many believe he'll never be released. He'll die in prison. As the sentence was read, Philip showed no emotion. His mother Diana sobbed quietly in the courtroom. She'd released a statement earlier expressing condolences to the Ritzer family and acknowledging that no one has suffered more than the Ritzer family. Philip was led from the courtroom in shackles. He would be held in a juvenile facility until age 18, then transferred to an adult Massachusetts state prison. Colleen Ritzer's family left the courthouse with mixed feelings. They'd gotten justice, a harsh sentence that ensured Philip would spend most or all of his life behind bars, but no sentence could bring Colleen back. Justice was served, Tom Ritzer told reporters, but we still go home to an empty house. If there was any doubt about Philip Chisholm's capacity for violence, it was erased by what happened next. On June 2, 2014, less than a year after murdering Colleen Ritzer, Philip, then 15, attacked a female counselor at the Department of Youth Services Detention Center in Dorchester, Massachusetts, where he was being held awaiting trial. According to prosecutors, Philip snuck into a staff bathroom and hid. When a 29-year-old female clinician entered, he ambushed her. He tried to strangle her. He punched her repeatedly in the face. He attempted to sexually assault her. The woman fought back desperately. She screamed. Other staff members heard and rushed to help. They pulled Philip off her and restrained him. As they subdued him, Philip shouted, "I'm going to kill them all." The clinician survived but suffered severe injuries, bruises across her face and neck, cuts on her arms and back, psychological trauma that haunted her for years. In her victim impact statement, read at Philip's 2024 sentencing for this attack, she wrote, "I remember the bruises across my face and my body around my neck, the cuts to my arm and back, the pure exhaustion of having to struggle against being assaulted, thinking I was going to die in that bathroom." Although the physical bruising has long disappeared, 10 years later, I still feel that force hitting me repeatedly, reminding me that I almost lost my life to Philip Chisholm. For nearly a decade, Philip fought the charges related to this attack, but in April of 2024, now 25 years old, he finally pleaded guilty to assault with intent to murder, assault and battery with a dangerous weapon, and kidnapping. He was sentenced to 17 to 20 years in state prison, to run concurrently with his murder sentence, meaning this additional conviction doesn't extend his minimum incarceration time, but it adds weight to his record when he eventually faces a parole board. The attack on the clinician revealed something crucial. Philip Chisholm's violence wasn't a one-time psychotic break. It was a pattern. He'd attacked and nearly killed another woman in a bathroom, just like he'd done to Colleen Ritzer. This pattern undermined his defense's claims that the murder of Colleen was an isolated incident caused by mental illness. It suggested instead that Philip Chisholm was a predator who targeted vulnerable women when he thought he could get away with it. Philip Chisholm didn't accept his conviction quietly. Over the next decade, his attorneys filed multiple appeals, arguing the judge improperly excluded brain scan evidence that would have shown Philip suffered from a psychotic disorder. The sentence of 40 years before parole eligibility effectively constitutes life without parole, violating Massachusetts constitutional protections for juveniles. The jury instructions were flawed, prejudicing the jury against the insanity defense. The Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court heard arguments in October 2024. Philip's attorneys argued passionately that the trial judge had prevented them from presenting critical evidence about Philip's mental state, specifically neuroimaging studies showing brain abnormalities consistent with psychosis. The Ritzer family released a statement ahead of the hearing. The heinous crime committed against our daughter and sister Colleen was an attack on her and all that is good in the world. Her life was viciously and brutally taken by this evil individual, and the horror she endured is unimaginable. It is clear and agreed to by a trial and jury of his peers that the convict's actions were premeditated, calculated, and committed of pure evil based upon overwhelming evidence. Without any admission of remorse, this evil individual cannot be rehabilitated. They emphasized that if Philip's sentence were reduced, he could be eligible for parole at age 39. Colleen and our family will not be afforded a second chance, they wrote. If we live in a just society, neither should he. On February 25, 2025, more than 11 years after Colleen's murder, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court issued its ruling. All appeals denied. The court found no errors in the trial. The conviction and sentence would stand. Philip Chisholm would remain in prison with no parole eligibility until 2054. The Ritzer family released another statement. While true justice can never be served for Colleen, we are grateful that this decision brings some peace, knowing that the convict will serve his sentence, at least until the parole hearing. This ruling allows us to finally grieve without the uncertainty of an appeal looming over Colleen's family and friends. After more than a decade of legal battles, the case was finally definitively closed. Philip Chisholm would spend the rest of his life behind bars, or at minimum, the next 3 decades. In the years since Colleen Ritzer's murder, her family, friends, and former students have worked to ensure she's remembered not as a victim, but as the extraordinary teacher she was. The Colleen Ritzer Memorial Scholarship was established to provide financial support to students pursuing careers in education. The scholarship has already helped dozens of students attend college and follow in Colleen's footsteps, becoming teachers who inspire and care for their students just as she did. Every year, Danvers High School holds a Day of Remembrance on October 22nd. Students and staff gather to honor Colleen's memory. They share stories about her kindness, her dedication, her impact. They plant flowers. They release balloons. They promise to live the values she embodied. A memorial garden was created on the Danvers High School campus, featuring a bench inscribed with Colleen's favorite quote, "Be the change you wish to see in the world." Students often sit there between classes, finding a moment of peace in her memory. Colleen's family has become advocates for teacher safety. They've spoken at education conferences, lobbied for better security protocols, and pushed for mental health resources in schools. They've turned their grief into action, trying to prevent another family from experiencing what they've endured. But they've also been candid about the cost. In interviews, Peggy Ritzer has described how Colleen's murder shattered their family, how holidays are unbearable, how every achievement Colleen should have celebrated, her younger sister's wedding, nieces and nephews being born, are reminders of absence. "People ask if we've found closure," Peggy said in a 2020 interview. "There is no closure when your child is murdered. There's only learning to live with a permanent hole in your heart." The case of Philip Chisholm and Colleen Ritzer forces us to grapple with deeply uncomfortable questions. Was Philip Chisholm mentally ill? His defense presented credible psychiatric evidence of psychosis, but his actions, the planning, the concealment, the repeated violence, suggest conscious choice. Can both be true? Can someone be mentally ill and still be held fully accountable for their crimes? Should a 14-year-old ever receive a 40-year minimum sentence? Philip was a child when he committed murder. By the time he's eligible for parole, he'll have spent more years in prison than he lived free. Is that justice? Or is it revenge masquerading as justice? How do we balance rehabilitation with public safety? If Philip Chisholm is ever paroled at age 54, he'll have spent 4 decades behind bars. Will he be rehabilitated, or will he remain dangerous? And if he's never released, have we given up on the possibility that even the worst offenders can change? What do we owe teachers? Colleen Ritzer stayed late to help students. That decision cost her life. How do we protect educators who make themselves available, who trust their students, who believe in second chances and redemption? These questions have no easy answers. Different people will reach different conclusions based on their values, their experiences, their beliefs about crime and punishment. But everyone can agree on this. Colleen Ritzer deserved better. She deserved to grow old, to teach for decades, to inspire thousands of students. She deserved to fall in love, get married, have children of her own. She deserved to see her students graduate, to receive thank you notes from kids whose lives she changed. She deserved a life. Philip Chisholm took that from her, and whether you believe he's a monster or a mentally ill child, whether you think his sentence is just or excessive, whether you believe in rehabilitation or permanent incarceration, the fact remains that a 24-year-old woman who dedicated her life to helping teenagers is dead because one of those teenagers chose violence. Philip Chisholm, now 26 years old, is incarcerated in a Massachusetts state prison. He's no longer the skinny 14-year-old who appeared in court. He's a man now, having spent nearly half his life behind bars. According to prison records, he's been a disciplinary problem. Beyond the 2014 attack on the clinician, he's had multiple infractions. He's been in solitary confinement. He's shown little interest in rehabilitation programs. If he serves his minimum sentence, he'll be released in 2054 at age 54. But many believe, including the Ritzer family, that he'll never be paroled, that the nature of his crimes, combined with his continued violence in prison, will keep him incarcerated for life. The Ritzer family continues to live with the aftermath of Colleen's murder. Peggy and Tom Ritzer have become reluctant public figures speaking about teacher safety and victim advocacy. But they've said repeatedly that they wish they could return to anonymity, to a life where their daughter is alive and they're not defined by her murder. Colleen's siblings have grown older. They've pursued careers, started families, but they do so with the constant awareness of who's missing. At every wedding, every holiday, every milestone, there's an empty chair where Colleen should be sitting. Danvers High School installed new security measures after Colleen's murder. Cameras were upgraded. Bathroom access was restricted after school hours. Teachers were advised never to be alone with students in isolated areas, a tragic loss of trust and accessibility. But the school also worked to preserve Colleen's legacy. New teachers are told about her. Students learn her story. She's become a symbol of what teaching should be: selfless, dedicated, caring. Even in death, Colleen Ritzer is still teaching. There's a detail from the trial that haunts many who followed the case. When police arrested Philip Chisholm on Route 1 hours after the murder, he was calm, casual. He told officers he was watching a movie. In a sense, that statement, bizarre and disconnected, captures something essential about this case. Philip Chisholm treated Colleen Ritzer's murder like fiction, like something happening on a screen, not in reality. He raped her, stabbed her 16 times, wheeled her body through a school, and dumped her in the woods, then walked away like he'd just watched a horror movie, not committed one. That dissociation, that inability or unwillingness to recognize the humanity of his victim, is what makes this case so deeply disturbing. Whether you believe Philip was mentally ill or simply evil, that disconnect is what allowed him to destroy Colleen Ritzer's life without apparent remorse. Colleen spent her final moments alone with a student she'd tried to help. She died in a school bathroom, a place that should be safe. Her last thoughts were likely terror, pain, betrayal. She was 24 years old, her whole life ahead of her. And her killer? He's 26 now. He'll likely spend the rest of his life in prison. Some would say that's justice. Others would say it's not enough. Still others would say it's too much, that a mentally ill 14-year-old deserved treatment, not a life sentence. But one thing is certain, nothing can undo what happened on October 22, 2013. Nothing can bring Colleen Ritzer back to her family, her students, her classroom. Nothing can restore the life of quiet heroism she was living. In her memory jar, that collection of notes and mementos she kept, students had written things like, "You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." Colleen Ritzer believed in her students. She believed in second chances, in hard work, in the power of education to change lives. She believed in staying late, in being available, in caring more than required. And one of her students repaid that belief with murder. That's the tragedy of this case. Not just that a young woman died, though that's horrific enough, but that she died because she cared, because she was kind, because she stayed late to help a student who needed her. She was a teacher until the very end. Case 5. Ethan Crumbley, November 30th, 2021, Oxford High School in Michigan. A typical Tuesday morning until 12:51 p.m. when the unthinkable shattered the hallways of what students called their second home. 15-year-old Ethan Crumbley pulled out a semi-automatic handgun his parents had bought him just 4 days earlier as an early Christmas present. What followed was a calculated execution that would leave 4 students dead, 7 others injured, and an entire nation demanding answers to one haunting question. How did everyone miss the signs? But this wasn't a story of signs being missed. This was a story of signs being seen and deliberately ignored. Ethan Crumbley seemed like any other sophomore at Oxford High. He wasn't the stereotypical outcast, the loner lurking in the shadows. He had friends. He attended classes. He looked, to most, unremarkable. But beneath that ordinary exterior, something dark was festering, and the people who should have noticed weren't just oblivious, they were complicit. In the months leading up to the massacre, Ethan's behavior had begun to deteriorate. He posted disturbing content online. He researched school shootings. He made videos about his violent fantasies. And the night before he walked into Oxford High with murder on his mind, he recorded audio on his phone, a chilling preview of what was to come. "I'm going to have so much fun tomorrow." His words weren't hypothetical. They were a promise. On the morning of November 30th, just hours before the shooting, a teacher discovered something that should have stopped everything: a drawing. On Ethan's desk was a sketch of a handgun, a person bleeding from gunshot wounds, and phrases scrawled across the page: "The thoughts won't stop. Help me." Another drawing showed a bullet with the words, "Blood everywhere." The school immediately called his parents, James and Jennifer Crumbley, into an emergency meeting. School officials laid out the disturbing evidence in front of them. They recommended Ethan receive immediate mental health intervention. They urged the parents to take him home that day. James and Jennifer Crumbley refused. They didn't search his backpack where the gun was hidden at that very moment. They didn't take him out of school. They didn't secure the weapon they had just purchased for him 4 days prior. Instead, they returned to work, leaving their son in the building with a loaded 9mm Sig Sauer handgun and 30 rounds of ammunition. Less than 3 hours later, Ethan emerged from a bathroom and began firing. At 12:51 p.m., Ethan Crumbley opened fire in the hallways of Oxford High School. Students scattered, diving into classrooms, barricading doors, texting frantic goodbyes to their parents. Teachers became human shields. The sound of gunfire echoed through corridors where laughter had filled the air just moments before. Ethan wasn't spraying bullets wildly. He was methodical, calculated. He executed his classmates at point blank range. Madison Baldwin, 17 years old, a senior with dreams of attending college, was shot and killed. Tate Meyer, 16, an honor student and star football player, was shot while trying to disarm Ethan. He died in a patrol car on the way to the hospital, a hero who gave his life trying to stop the carnage. Hannah St. Juliana, 14, a freshman basketball player and artist, was gunned down in the hallway. Ethan shot her once, then, as she lay wounded on the ground, he shot her again. An execution. Justin Schilling, 17, a senior and a beloved member of the bowling team, was forced to his knees before Ethan shot him at point-blank range. Another execution. 6 other students and 1 teacher were injured in the rampage. The shooting lasted less than 5 minutes, but the damage was irreversible. 4 young lives gone. Dozens more shattered. A community destroyed. When law enforcement arrived, Ethan surrendered immediately. He didn't run. He didn't resist. He put his hands up and allowed himself to be taken into custody without a word of remorse. As investigators began piecing together what happened, a horrifying reality emerged. This massacre wasn't just preventable. It was practically announced in advance, and the people who had the power to stop it chose to do nothing. James and Jennifer Crumbley had bought their son the murder weapon, a Sig Sauer 9mm handgun, on Black Friday, just 4 days before the shooting. Jennifer even posted on social media about the purchase, calling it Ethan's new Christmas present and taking him to the shooting range to practice. When Ethan texted her about hearing voices and seeing demons in the house, she told him to suck it up and ignored him. The gun was never locked up. It was stored in an unlocked drawer in their bedroom, easily accessible to their increasingly disturbed son. Even after the school meeting on the morning of the shooting, even after seeing the violent drawings, the cries for help, they didn't check if the gun was still in the drawer. They didn't take Ethan home. They didn't secure the weapon. They chose denial over action, and 4 teenagers paid with their lives. When Jennifer Crumbley learned about the shooting, her first instinct wasn't to call authorities or rush to the school to check on victims. She texted Ethan, "Ethan, don't do it." Too late. Then, instead of cooperating with law enforcement, James and Jennifer Crumbley withdrew $4,000 from an ATM and went on the run. They were found hiding in a Detroit warehouse days later, arrested and charged with 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter, 1 for each student their son murdered. It was a historic moment. Never before in American history had parents been criminally charged for their child's mass school shooting. Ethan Crumbley's trial was straightforward. He pleaded guilty to 1 count of terrorism causing death, 4 counts of first-degree murder, and 19 other charges. In court, he admitted everything. He showed no emotion, no remorse, no explanation beyond his own selfish desire for infamy. During his sentencing hearing in December 2023, victim impact statements filled the courtroom with raw, unfiltered grief. Parents described the unbearable weight of burying their children. Siblings spoke of the silence in their homes where laughter once lived. Survivors recounted the nightmares that plagued them every night. The sound of gunshots, the blood, the screams. Justin Schilling's father, Craig, told the court he suffers from PTSD and can barely get out of bed most days. Madison Baldwin's mother, Nicole Beausoleil, described how her daughter was shot at point-blank range and how that image haunts her every waking moment. Ethan sat silent, expressionless, a void where empathy should have existed. Judge Kwame Rowe sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He noted that Ethan had shown a long obsession with violence and that rehabilitation was unlikely. Rowe described the execution-style murders: Justin forced to his knees, Hannah shot twice to finish the job, and declared that Ethan had committed these acts for notoriety, wanting to go down as the biggest school shooter in Michigan history. Ethan Crumbley will spend the rest of his life behind bars. He will never walk free. He will never know the life his victims were robbed of. And he will never explain why he did it, because even he admitted in his own words "This is nobody's fault but my own." But the story didn't end with Ethan's conviction. In a legal first, James and Jennifer Crumbley faced separate trials for involuntary manslaughter. Prosecutors argued that their gross negligence and chilling lack of remorse directly contributed to the deaths of 4 students. The evidence was damning. Jennifer Crumbley took the stand in her own defense, and her testimony was nothing short of astonishing. When asked if she would have done anything differently, she replied, "I wouldn't have." She showed no accountability, no reflection, no grief for the children her son murdered with a gun she helped provide. James Crumbley, meanwhile, was caught on recorded jail phone calls making profanity-laced threats against the prosecutor, knowing full well the calls were being monitored. He showed anger, not at himself, not at his son, but at the system, holding him accountable. The prosecution laid out a clear narrative. James and Jennifer Crumbley had repeated opportunities to prevent the tragedy. They saw the warning signs. They were told by school officials that their son needed help. They refused to act. They bought him a gun. They left it unsecured. They ignored his deteriorating mental health. And on the morning of the shooting, when they were presented with violent drawings and explicit cries for help, they sent him back to class with a loaded weapon in his backpack. In February 2024, Jennifer Crumbley was convicted on all 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter. In March 2024, James Crumbley was convicted on the same charges. It was a historic moment, the first time in U.S. history that parents of a school shooter were found criminally responsible for their child's massacre. At their sentencing in April 2024, the victims' families finally had the chance to confront the parents who had enabled this nightmare. Nicole Beausoleil, Madison Baldwin's mother, looked directly at the Crumbleys and said, "Not only did your son kill my daughter, but you both did as well. The words involuntary should not be a part of your offense. Everything you did that day, months prior, and days after, were voluntary acts helping your son commit murder. Not just one, but multiple." Judge Cheryl Matthews sentenced both James and Jennifer Crumbley to 10 to 15 years in prison. She stated, "These convictions are not about poor parenting. These convictions confirm repeated acts or lack of acts that could have halted an oncoming runaway train. Opportunity knocked over and over again, louder and louder, and was ignored. No one answered, and these 2 people should have." James and Jennifer Crumbley are now serving their sentences in separate facilities. They will not be housed together. They have been barred from contacting their son, and when they are eventually released, they will carry the weight of history, the first parents ever held criminally accountable for their child's school shooting. Amid the legal proceedings, the courtroom drama, and the historic convictions, it's easy to lose sight of what truly matters. 4 young people are gone forever. Madison Baldwin was 17 years old, an artist and a scholar with a bright future ahead of her. Her family remembers her as someone who brought light into every room she entered. Tate Meyer was 16, a star athlete and honor student who died trying to stop the shooter. His community petitioned to rename the school's football stadium after him, a testament to his bravery and character. Hannah St. Juliana was 14, the youngest victim. She loved basketball, art, and making people laugh. Her family describes the unbearable silence in their home since her death. Justin Schilling was 17, a kind-hearted young man who loved bowling and had dreams of the future. His father described the agony of living each day knowing his son was forced to his knees and executed. These weren't statistics. They were children with dreams, families, futures, and they were stolen from the world by a 15-year-old boy whose parents chose willful ignorance over responsibility. The Crumbley case changed everything. For decades, parents of school shooters had walked away without criminal consequences, even when warning signs were blatant. The legal system treated the shooters as isolated actors, anomalies, lone wolves. But the Oxford tragedy forced America to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the parents are complicit. The convictions of James and Jennifer Crumbley sent shockwaves through the nation. Legal experts called it a watershed moment in gun violence accountability. Prosecutors in other states began examining whether they could pursue similar charges in future cases. Parents across the country were forced to reckon with a new reality. If you provide your child with a weapon, ignore the warning signs, and fail to intervene, you could go to prison. Some applauded the decision, arguing that accountability must extend beyond the shooter. Others worried about the precedent, questioning where the line is drawn between parental responsibility and criminal liability. But for the families of Madison Baldwin, Tate Myre, Hannah St. Juliana, and Justin Schilling, the convictions offered something invaluable: validation. Validation that their children's deaths were preventable. Validation that the adults who failed them would face consequences. Validation that the system, for once, got it right. Despite the convictions, the trials, and the historic sentences, one haunting question remains. Why did Ethan Crumbley do it? He offered no clear motive, no manifesto, no explanation beyond a vague desire for infamy. Psychologists who examined him found no evidence of psychosis or severe mental illness that would explain the level of violence he committed. He wasn't bullied. He wasn't ostracized. He wasn't fighting back against tormentors. He simply decided one day that he wanted to kill. And when the opportunity presented itself, when his parents handed him a gun and ignored every warning sign, he took it. Perhaps that's the most terrifying part of the Oxford shooting. There was no grand ideological cause, no revenge plot, no tragic backstory that made sense of the senselessness. Ethan Crumbley murdered his classmates because he wanted to, and his parents gave him the tools to do it. Oxford High School reopened months after the shooting, but it will never be the same. The hallways where Madison, Tate, Hannah, and Justin once walked are now haunted by their absence. Memorials stand in their honor. Counselors remain on staff to help students process the trauma. Survivors carry the weight of that day with them, forever changed by 5 minutes of terror. The community has tried to heal, but healing is impossible when the wounds are this deep. Parents drop their children off at school and wonder if they'll come home. Students glance at exits during class, their minds running through escape plans. Teachers lock their doors and look at their students, knowing that somewhere in America, another school will soon face the same nightmare. The Crumbley case was a turning point, a moment when America finally acknowledged that school shootings aren't just about the shooters. They're about the systems that fail, the adults who look away, and the deadly consequences of willful ignorance. Ethan Crumbley will spend the rest of his life in prison. James and Jennifer Crumbley will serve their sentences and eventually walk free. But the families of the victims, they've been sentenced to a lifetime of grief, their hearts forever shattered by a tragedy that never had to happen. And that, perhaps, is the cruelest truth of all. Case 6. Bryan Kohberger. November 13, 2022, Moscow, Idaho. A quiet college town where the most excitement usually came from football games and Friday night parties. In an off-campus rental house on King Road, 6 University of Idaho students were winding down their weekend. 4 of them would never see morning. Around 4 a.m., as the house slept in darkness, a figure dressed in black slipped through an unlocked door. He wore gloves. He carried a large fixed-blade knife. And he knew exactly what he was about to do. Within minutes, 4 young people, Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, were brutally stabbed to death in their beds. The killer moved through the house with chilling efficiency, then vanished into the night, leaving behind a scene so horrific that seasoned investigators would later describe it as one of the worst they'd ever witnessed. For weeks, the case went cold. No arrests, no suspects, no answers. The community lived in terror, wondering who among them was capable of such calculated violence. And then, nearly 7 weeks later, police arrested a 28-year-old PhD student from nearby Washington State University. His name was Bryan Kohberger. His field of study? Criminology, the science of understanding, investigating, and preventing crime. The irony was as disturbing as it was undeniable. The man who murdered 4 college students was studying to catch killers just like himself. Bryan Christopher Kohberger didn't look like a monster. He was tall, lean, with bushy eyebrows and an intense stare. To most who knew him, he seemed awkward but harmless. Socially uncomfortable, yes, but not dangerous. He was pursuing his PhD in criminal justice and criminology at Washington State University, just 10 miles from the University of Idaho campus in Moscow. His research focused on how offenders make decisions, how they choose their victims, and how they evade capture. He wasn't just learning about criminals, he was learning how to become one. In his graduate coursework, Kohberger studied crime scene analysis, investigative techniques, and the psychology of murderers. He read case files. He analyzed patterns. He learned what mistakes killers made, and perhaps more importantly, how to avoid making those same mistakes himself. But while he projected the image of a studious academic, something darker lurked beneath the surface. Former classmates would later describe him as off-putting and creepy. One female student reported that he'd sit uncomfortably close to her in class, staring at her for long periods without speaking. Others noticed his fixation on violent crimes, particularly cases involving women. He wasn't just interested in criminology, he was obsessed. And in the months leading up to the murders, that obsession transformed into something far more sinister, a plan. The victims lived together in a modest off-campus house at 1122 King Road in Moscow, Idaho. It was the kind of place where college memories were made, late-night study sessions, laughter echoing through the hallways, friends gathering after long days of classes. For Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, this house was more than just a rental. It was home. Kaylee Goncalves, 21, was a senior set to graduate in December. She was vibrant, outgoing, and deeply loved by her family. She'd recently landed her dream job and was planning to move to Texas to start the next chapter of her life. She had everything to live for. Madison Maddie Mogen, 21, was Kaylee's best friend. So close they were practically sisters. The two had shared countless memories together, and on the night of the murders, they'd gone out to a local bar, enjoying what should have been just another carefree college night. Maddie was kind-hearted, full of life, and adored by everyone who knew her. Xana Kernodle, 20, was a junior studying marketing. She was creative, ambitious, and in love with her boyfriend, Ethan Chapin. The couple had been together for over a year, and their relationship was the kind that made people believe in young love. Ethan Chapin, 20, was a freshman and a member of the Sigma Chi fraternity. He was athletic, friendly, and had his whole life ahead of him. On the night of November 12th, he'd stayed over at the King Road house to spend time with Xana, a decision that would cost him his life. None of them knew that in the weeks leading up to that fateful night, their house was being watched, that a predator had been circling, studying their routines, learning their patterns, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And that predator was Bryan Kohberger. Cell phone data would later reveal the chilling truth. Bryan Kohberger had been to the King Road house at least 12 times before the murders. He'd driven past in the late-night hours, circling the neighborhood, watching, waiting. His white Hyundai Elantra had been captured on surveillance cameras in the area multiple times, always during the early morning hours when most of the town was asleep. He wasn't randomly driving around, he was hunting. Investigators believe Kohberger may have fixated on one or more of the victims, possibly through social media. He allegedly followed them online, studied their posts, learned their schedules. One report suggested he'd viewed photos of one of the female victims on Instagram, photos taken from inside the very house he would later invade. In August 2022, 3 months before the murders, Kohberger made a purchase on Amazon: a Ka-Bar knife, a large fixed-blade hunting knife favored by military personnel. After buying it, he deleted the purchase history from his account. But the internet never forgets, and investigators would later recover that damning evidence. He was preparing, planning, perfecting every detail. And on the night of November 12, 2022, he decided it was time to act. At approximately 4:00 a.m. on November 13, 2022, Bryan Kohberger entered the King Road house through an unlocked sliding glass door on the second floor. He was dressed in black, wearing gloves and a mask. He carried his Ka-Bar knife, 7 inches of cold steel designed to kill. What happened next was a nightmare. Kohberger moved through the house with terrifying efficiency, stabbing his victims multiple times as they slept. The attack was brutal, intimate, and devastatingly quick. Kaylee and Maddie, who shared a room on the 3rd floor, were killed in their beds. Xana and Ethan, asleep in a 2nd-floor bedroom, were also ambushed and murdered. The coroner would later determine that each victim had been stabbed multiple times, some with defensive wounds, indicating they'd tried to fight back in their final moments. The savagery of the attack was overwhelming. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was execution. But here's where the case becomes even more disturbing. 2 other roommates were in the house that night, on the 1st floor, and they survived. One of those roommates, Dylan Mortensen, would later testify that she heard noises around 4 a.m. She opened her bedroom door and saw a figure dressed in black, a tall man with bushy eyebrows and a mask, walking toward the back exit. She stood frozen in terror as he passed by her, just feet away, and left through the sliding door. She didn't immediately call 911. Paralyzed by fear and confusion, she locked herself in her room, unsure of what she'd just witnessed. It wasn't until hours later, around 11:58 a.m., that one of the surviving roommates finally called the police, reporting an unconscious person. When officers arrived, they discovered a scene of unimaginable horror. 4 young people brutally murdered, blood everywhere, and a single piece of critical evidence left behind, a knife sheath found on Madison Mogen's bed. On that sheath was a single source of DNA, and it belonged to Bryan Kohberger. For weeks after the murders, the case went cold. Moscow, Idaho, a town of just 25,000 people, was gripped by fear. Students fled the campus. Parents demanded answers. The FBI joined the investigation, and tips poured in by the thousands. But there were no arrests, no suspects, just silence. Behind the scenes, however, investigators were piecing together a digital trail. Surveillance footage from around Moscow showed a white Hyundai Elantra driving near the King Road house multiple times in the hours before and after the murders. License plate readers and traffic cameras tracked its movements, and detectives began searching for the owner. Meanwhile, forensic analysts were working on the DNA found on the knife sheath. It was male DNA, but it didn't match anyone in the criminal database. So investigators turned to genetic genealogy, the same technique used to catch the Golden State Killer. By tracing the DNA through public ancestry databases, they identified a potential suspect, Bryan Kohberger. Police discovered that Kohberger drove a white Hyundai Elantra. He lived in Pullman, Washington, just 10 miles from Moscow, and his cell phone data placed him in the vicinity of the King Road house repeatedly in the weeks before the murders. On December 30th, 2022, nearly 7 weeks after the killings, police arrested Bryan Kohberger at his parents' home in Pennsylvania, where he was visiting for the holidays. Inside his car, investigators found evidence that he'd meticulously cleaned the interior. They recovered black clothing, gloves, and a flashlight. His phone showed he'd been back to the King Road house in the early morning hours after the murders, returning to the scene of his crime, just as some killers do. And when they searched his apartment in Pullman, they found something chilling: materials related to crime scene investigation and criminal behavior. The man who'd studied how to catch killers had tried to use that knowledge to evade capture, but he'd made one critical mistake. He'd left behind the knife sheath, and with it, his DNA. Bryan Kohberger was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. The evidence against him was overwhelming: DNA at the scene, cell phone data placing him near the house, surveillance footage of his car, and witness testimony describing a man matching his appearance. But as the case moved toward trial, one question loomed larger than any other: why? Investigators found no connection between Kohberger and the victims. He didn't know them personally. They'd never been in the same classes. They had no mutual friends. There was no romantic rejection, no personal vendetta, no clear motive. Prosecutors believe Kohberger may have fixated on the victims through social media, possibly developing an obsession with one or more of the women. But without a confession, the truth remains locked inside his mind. In July 2025, facing overwhelming evidence and the near certainty of a death sentence, Kohberger accepted a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary, waiving his right to appeal in exchange for the prosecution dropping the death penalty. At his plea hearing, when asked if he was pleading guilty because he was guilty, Kohberger responded with a single word: yes. But he offered no explanation, no apology, no insight into why he'd brutally murdered 4 innocent people. The families of the victims sat in the courtroom, desperate for answers, and Kohberger gave them nothing. On July 23, 2025, Bryan Kohberger appeared in court for his sentencing hearing. The victims' families and friends filled the courtroom, finally given the chance to confront the man who'd destroyed their lives. One by one, they stood and spoke. Dylan Mortensen, the surviving roommate who'd seen Kohberger that night, sobbed as she described the guilt and trauma that plagued her. He is a hollow vessel, something less than human, a body without empathy, without remorse. Steve Goncalves, Kaylee's father, addressed Kohberger directly, his voice shaking with rage. He mocked Kohberger for leaving his DNA on the knife sheath, a rookie mistake for someone studying criminology. You were that careless, that foolish, that stupid. Scott Laramie, Madison's stepfather, spoke through tears. This world was a better place with her in it. Karen and I are ordinary people, but we lived extraordinary lives because we had Maddie. Xana Kernodle's family described the unbearable silence in their home since her death. Ethan Chapin's family, though they didn't attend in person, submitted statements expressing their devastation. Throughout it all, Bryan Kohberger sat expressionless. When Judge Stephen Hippler asked if he wanted to make a statement before sentencing, Kohberger declined. "I respectfully decline," he said quietly, the only words he spoke during the entire hearing. Judge Hippler sentenced Kohberger to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years for burglary. He will spend the rest of his life in prison. But for the families, the sentence felt hollow. Justice had been served, but the most important question remained unanswered. Why did he do it? And Bryan Kohberger, the criminology student who'd spent years studying the minds of killers, refused to reveal what lay inside his own. Amid the legal proceedings and the media frenzy, it's crucial to remember who was lost that night. Kaylee Goncalves had her dream job waiting for her in Texas. She was about to graduate, about to start her life. Her family remembers her as someone who lit up every room she entered, a force of nature taken far too soon. Madison Mogen was inseparable from Kaylee. The two had been best friends for years, sharing countless memories and dreams for the future. Her stepfather described her as the light of their lives. Xana Kernodle was passionate, creative, and deeply in love. She had plans, ambitions, a future full of promise. Her family speaks of the unbearable void her absence has left. Ethan Chapin was just beginning his college journey. He was an athlete, a friend, a beloved son. His family describes him as kind-hearted and full of potential, a life barely lived before it was stolen. These four young people weren't just statistics. They were children, friends, loved ones. They had inside jokes, favorite songs, dreams that would never be realized, and they were slaughtered in their sleep by a man who saw them as nothing more than objects in his twisted experiment. Bryan Kohberger's case is haunting for many reasons, but perhaps the most disturbing is the sheer irony of it all. Here was a man who dedicated years of his life to studying criminal behavior, how killers think, how they choose victims, how they evade capture. He'd read case studies of murderers, analyzed their mistakes, learned the patterns that led to their downfall, and then he became one of them. Latah County. Prosecutor Bill Thompson stated that there was no evidence Kohberger had a history of violence or a criminal record before the murders. He wasn't a troubled youth with a record of escalating crimes. He was, by all outward appearances, an ordinary graduate student, but something inside him was broken. Whether it was a desire for control, a fascination with death, or something else entirely, Bryan Kohberger crossed a line that most people can't even imagine approaching. His case raises uncomfortable questions. Can studying violence make someone more likely to commit it? Did his immersion in criminology desensitize him to the humanity of his victims? Or was he always a predator, simply using his education to refine his methods? We may never know, because Bryan Kohberger, the man who studied killers for years, has chosen to remain silent about his own motivations. The University of Idaho campus was forever changed by the murders. Students who once felt safe walking home at night now live with fear. The house on King Road, where 4 young lives were stolen, became a grim landmark, a place of pilgrimage for true crime tourists and a source of ongoing trauma for the community. Initially, the university planned to demolish the house before the start of the fall semester, but families of the victims protested. They argued that the house was crucial evidence and that its destruction would feel like erasing their loved one's memory. The demolition was delayed, but eventually the house was torn down, a painful reminder that no amount of physical removal can erase the trauma of what happened there. The surviving roommates, Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funke, have lived with survivor's guilt and PTSD. Mortensen described crippling panic attacks and the haunting memory of seeing Kohberger walk past her that night. Both women have struggled to return to normal life, forever changed by the fact that they were feet away from a killer and survived only by chance. The case also sparked national debates about campus safety, off-campus housing security, and the responsibilities of universities to protect their students. Moscow, Idaho, a town that once prided itself on being a safe, close-knit community, will forever be associated with one of the most horrific crimes in the state's history. Bryan Kohberger's case stands as one of the most chilling examples of calculated violence in recent memory. Unlike crimes of passion or impulsive acts of rage, this was premeditated, methodical, and executed with the precision of someone who understood exactly what he was doing. And that's what makes it so terrifying. Kohberger wasn't an uneducated killer acting on impulse. He was an intelligent, well-trained criminology student who used his knowledge to plan and execute a quadruple homicide. He studied the mistakes of other killers and tried to avoid them. He researched forensic techniques and attempted to cover his tracks. He understood the investigation process and tried to stay one step ahead. But in the end, his hubris was his downfall. The knife sheath, the cell phone data, the surveillance footage, the genetic genealogy, all the tools he had studied in his coursework were used against him. The system he'd spent years learning to navigate became the system that caught him. His case serves as a grim reminder that intelligence and education don't equate to morality. Knowledge can be used to save lives, or to take them. And sometimes the people who study darkness aren't trying to fight it. They're trying to master it. As Bryan Kohberger sits in his cell, serving 4 consecutive life sentences, one question continues to echo through the minds of investigators, victims' families, and the public. Why? Why did he choose this house? Why did he choose these victims? What was he hoping to achieve? Was it a thrill? A desire for control? A delusional sense of power? Or something else entirely? Something so twisted that even now he can't bring himself to articulate it. Moscow Police Lieutenant Darren Gilbertson stated after the sentencing, "We have never, to this day, found a single connection between him and the 4 victims or the 2 surviving roommates." The lack of motive makes the crime even more terrifying, because if Bryan Kohberger could murder 4 innocent people for no apparent reason, it means anyone could be next. There's no profile to watch for, no warning signs to heed, no way to protect yourself from someone who kills simply because they can. The families of Kaylee, Maddie, Xana, and Ethan are left to carry a burden no one should ever have to bear. The knowledge that their loved ones were murdered by a stranger for no reason, in a crime that should never have happened. And Bryan Kohberger, the man who once studied killers to understand them, has become the very thing he claimed to want to stop. A monster who will be studied for years to come, his motives forever locked away in the darkness of his own mind. Case 7. Devin Erickson, May 7, 2019. STEM School, Highlands Ranch in Douglas County, Colorado. It was near the end of the school year, that bittersweet time when seniors count down their final days and underclassmen dream of summer freedom. In room 107, a classroom of high school students sat in the dark, watching a movie as the school day wound down. It should have been just another ordinary afternoon. Then, at approximately 1:53 p.m., 2 students, Devin Erickson, 18, and Alec McKinney, 16, entered the classroom through separate doors, armed with handguns. They'd planned this moment for weeks, coordinating their attack to maximize casualties. They wanted to be infamous. They wanted their names remembered, alongside the Columbine killers they idolized. But they didn't account for one thing: Kendrick Castillo. In the chaos that followed, as students screamed and dove for cover, 18-year-old Kendrick, just 3 days away from graduation, made a split-second decision that would save countless lives and cost him his own. Without hesitation, without thinking of his own safety, he charged directly at Devin Erickson. Kendrick Castillo didn't survive that day. But because of his courage, a massacre was stopped before it truly began. His story is one of the purest acts of heroism in the dark history of American school shootings, a reminder that even in humanity's darkest moments, extraordinary bravery can emerge. This is the story of the STEM school shooting. It's a story about 2 killers who wanted infamy, and about one hero who wanted nothing more than to save his friends. Devin Michael Erickson was 18 years old, a senior at STEM School Highlands Ranch, a charter school focused on science, technology, engineering, and math. To those who knew him casually, Devin seemed like a typical teenager, quiet, somewhat withdrawn, but nothing that raised immediate alarm. He lived with his parents in the suburbs, attended school regularly, and was on track to graduate in just a few weeks. But beneath that ordinary exterior, something dark was festering. Devin had become obsessed with school shooters, particularly Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, the Columbine killers who'd massacred 13 people just 20 miles away 2 decades earlier. He researched mass shootings online. He studied the tactics, the weapons, the methods, and at some point, he stopped being a student of violence and decided to become a perpetrator. His partner in the plot was Alec McKinney, 16, a sophomore who was struggling with his own demons. McKinney, who was assigned female at birth but identified as male, later testified that he was dealing with gender dysphoria, bullying, and suicidal ideation. But instead of seeking help, he channeled his pain into rage and found a willing partner in Devin Erickson. Exactly how their partnership formed remains murky. During the trial, McKinney would testify that the shooting was Devin's idea, claiming Devin pressured him into participating. Devin's defense attorneys argued the opposite, that McKinney was the instigator and Devin was manipulated into going along with the plan. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Two troubled teenagers who found each other, fed off each other's darkness, and together decided to commit an act of unspeakable violence. They called their plan the victim-hero scenario. The idea was twisted. McKinney would either kill himself during the attack or be killed by Erickson, making him simultaneously a perpetrator and a victim. It was a sick fantasy born from too much time studying Columbine and not enough intervention from the adults who should have noticed something was wrong. For weeks they planned. They acquired weapons, handguns they'd obtained illegally. They chose their target, Room 107, where students would be watching a movie in the dark. They decided to enter through separate doors to trap students in crossfire. They prepared for their moment of infamy. And on May 7th, 2019, they walked into that classroom ready to kill as many people as possible. It was a typical school day. Room 107 was dark, the lights off, as students watched a film. Teacher Lauren Harper was supervising the class, unaware that in moments, her life and the lives of her students would be forever changed. At 1:53 p.m., Devin Erickson and Alec McKinney entered the classroom through separate doors, exactly as planned. They pulled out their handguns and opened fire. The sound of gunshots shattered the peaceful afternoon. Students screamed, some dove under desks, others froze in terror. Chaos erupted in seconds. But not everyone froze. Kendrick Castillo, sitting near the front of the classroom, was the first to move. While others hesitated, paralyzed by shock and fear, Kendrick did the unthinkable. He charged directly at Devin Erickson. He didn't think about his own safety. He didn't calculate his chances of survival. He saw a gunman threatening his classmates, and his instinct was to stop him, no matter the cost. Kendrick lunged at Erickson, grabbing for the gun, trying to wrestle it away. In that moment of selfless bravery, Erickson fired. The bullet struck Kendrick in the chest, but Kendrick's heroism had already set something in motion. Seeing him charge, two other students, Joshua Jones and Brendan BLE, rushed forward to help. Together, the three young men tackled Erickson, pinning him to the ground and disarming him. Erickson's gun jammed after firing 4 times. The malfunction, combined with the students' courage, meant the carnage was stopped before it could escalate into the mass slaughter Erickson and McKinney had envisioned. Meanwhile, Alec McKinney had fired from the other side of the classroom, wounding several students before being apprehended by a school security guard. The entire attack lasted less than 5 minutes, but in those 5 minutes, lives were irrevocably changed. 8 students were shot and wounded. Some suffered life-altering injuries. The teacher, Lauren Harper, was traumatized by what she witnessed and would later testify that she still has nightmares about that day. And Kendrick Castillo, the boy who charged a gunman without hesitation, lay dying on the classroom floor. Kendrick Ray Castillo was 18 years old, just 3 days away from graduating from STEM School Highlands Ranch. He was a senior with a bright future ahead of him, plans to attend college, dreams of a career in engineering or robotics, and a deep love for his family, especially his father, who had raised him as a single parent after Kendrick's mother passed away when he was young. Those who knew Kendrick described him as kind, selfless, and humble. He was the kid who helped classmates with their homework without being asked. He was the friend who went out of his way to make others feel included. He was the son who made his father proud every single day. He was also, as the world would soon learn, a hero. When Devin Erickson entered room 107 with a gun, Kendrick could have hidden. He could have run. He could have done what most people's survival instincts would tell them to do: protect yourself first. But Kendrick Castillo wasn't wired that way. His first instinct wasn't self-preservation, it was to protect others. And so, without a moment's hesitation, he charged. Multiple students testified at trial about what they witnessed that day. They described Kendrick launching himself at Erickson, grabbing for the gun, fighting with everything he had to stop the shooter. They described the sound of the gunshot, the bullet that struck Kendrick and ended his life. And they described the chaos that followed, Joshua Jones and Brendan Bialy joining the fight, the three of them together managing to disarm Erickson and pin him down until help arrived. But Kendrick never got to see the outcome of his bravery. He died on that classroom floor, surrounded by the classmates he'd saved. Paramedics rushed him to the hospital, but it was too late. Kendrick Castillo was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. He was 18 years old. He had his whole life ahead of him, and he gave it up to save his friends. While Kendrick Castillo is rightly remembered as the primary hero of the STEM school shooting, his bravery would not have been enough on its own. Two other young men, Joshua Jones and Brendan Bialy, also risked their lives that day, and their courage deserves recognition. Joshua Jones, a student in room 107, saw Kendrick charge Erickson and immediately joined the fight. He helped wrestle the gun away and held Erickson down while others called for help. Joshua was wounded during the struggle, but survived. Brendan Bialy, a senior who had enlisted in the Marines and was set to ship out to boot camp after graduation, also charged forward. His military training may have given him the mental fortitude to act under pressure, but it was raw courage that made him run toward danger when every instinct said to run away. Brenda helped subdue Erickson and prevent further violence. Both Joshua and Brendan were later honored for their bravery. Brendan, in particular, was celebrated by the Marines, who recognized his heroism even before he'd officially begun his service. But both young men have consistently deflected praise, insisting that Kendrick was the true hero, the one who moved first, who inspired them to act, and who paid the ultimate price. Together, these three young men stopped a massacre. They turned what could have been a Columbine-level catastrophe into a tragedy with only 1 death and 8 injuries. That only is a horrific word to use, but it's the truth. Because of Kendrick, Joshua, and Brendan, dozens of other students went home to their families that night. In addition to Kendrick Castillo, 8 other students were shot during the attack. Some suffered minor injuries. Others were gravely wounded and faced long, painful recoveries. The physical wounds healed over time, but the psychological scars remain. Students who were in room 107 that day have struggled with PTSD, anxiety, and survivor's guilt. Many have asked themselves the same agonizing question: why did I survive when Kendrick didn't? Teacher Lauren Harper, who witnessed the entire attack, has spoken about the nightmares that plague her. In court testimony, she described the trauma of watching her students being shot, the helplessness she felt, and the image of Kendrick lying on the floor, a memory that haunts her every day. But amid the trauma, there's also gratitude. Students who survived have said repeatedly that they owe their lives to Kendrick Castillo. Without his split-second decision to charge, the death toll would have been catastrophic. Devin Erickson and Alec McKinney had planned for maximum casualties. They wanted infamy. They wanted to rival Columbine. Kendrick Castillo made sure they failed. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, Chaos reigned. SWAT teams descended on the school. Parents frantically rushed to the scene, desperate for news about their children. Students were evacuated and taken to a nearby elementary school for reunification with their families. Devin Erickson was apprehended at the scene, tackled and held by students until police arrived. He was taken into custody without resistance. Alec McKinney, who'd been apprehended by a school security guard during the attack, was also arrested. Both were transported to the hospital, Erickson for minor injuries sustained during the struggle with students, McKinney for evaluation. As investigators began piecing together what happened, a disturbing picture emerged. This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence. It was premeditated, planned, and executed with the intent to kill as many people as possible. Evidence recovered from the scene and from the suspects' homes painted a chilling portrait of two teenagers obsessed with violence. Investigators found social media posts and private messages discussing the attack. Research on school shootings, particularly Columbine evidence that the weapons had been acquired illegally, plans and diagrams related to the attack. Both suspects were charged with first-degree murder, attempted murder, and a host of other charges. But because of their ages and the circumstances, they would be tried separately and under very different legal frameworks. Alec McKinney, who was 16 at the time of the shooting, was tried as a juvenile. In a surprising move, McKinney pleaded guilty to all charges and cooperated with prosecutors, testifying against Devin Erickson during his trial. McKinney admitted responsibility for the shooting and expressed remorse, though his sincerity was questioned by many. At sentencing, McKinney asked the court not to show leniency. He said he understood the gravity of what he'd done and accepted whatever punishment was deemed appropriate. The judge ultimately sentenced McKinney to life in prison, but because he was a juvenile at the time of the crime, he would be eligible for parole after serving 20 to 40 years under Colorado's juvenile offender program. Devin Erickson, who was 18 at the time and legally an adult, faced a full adult trial. His defense attorneys argued that Erickson had been manipulated by McKinney, pressured into participating in a plot he didn't fully understand or control. They painted him as a troubled teenager who fell under the influence of a more dominant personality. But the evidence told a different story. Prosecutors presented testimony from students, investigators, and even McKinney himself, all pointing to Erickson as a willing and perhaps the primary participant in the attack. Surveillance footage showed Erickson entering the classroom with a gun, opening fire, and only being stopped when students tackled him. The trial lasted 3 weeks and saw approximately 60 witnesses testify. On June 15, 2021, after days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. Guilty on all 46 counts, including first-degree murder, attempted murder, and weapons charges. Devin Erickson showed virtually no emotion as the verdicts were read. On September 17, 2021, Devin Erickson appeared in court for his sentencing hearing. It was a day the victims' families had been waiting for, a chance to confront the person who'd murdered Kendrick Castillo and shattered so many lives. One by one, they stood and spoke. Kendrick's father, John Castillo, spoke through tears about the son he'd lost, the boy who'd been his whole world, his best friend, his reason for living. He described the unbearable silence in their home, the empty chair at the dinner table, the future that would never be. "My son died a hero," he said, "but I would give anything to have him back as just my son." Students who survived the attack spoke about the trauma they still carry, the nightmares, the guilt. They talked about Kendrick's bravery and how they think about him every single day. Teacher Lauren Harper, who'd been supervising Room 107 that day, spoke about the psychological toll of witnessing the attack. She described flashbacks, panic attacks, and the constant fear that it could happen again. "I still see Kendrick lying on that floor," she said. "I see it every time I close my eyes." Throughout the statements, Devin Erickson sat motionless. He wore handcuffs, a red and white striped prison jumpsuit, and a face mask. The sentencing took place during the COVID-19 pandemic. He displayed virtually no emotion, no tears, no remorse, no acknowledgement of the pain he'd caused. When given the opportunity to speak, Erickson declined. Judge Teresa Michelle Slade did not hold back in her sentencing remarks. She noted that Erickson had shown no remorse, had failed to help the community understand his actions, and had devastated not only those directly impacted, but countless others beyond the school. "I don't think there is anything I can say to you, Mr. Erickson, that would make any difference," Judge Slade said. She sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the first-degree murder conviction. Then, to emphasize the gravity of his crimes and to honor each victim he'd tried to kill, she added hundreds of years of additional prison time for the attempted murder charges and other counts. The final tally: life plus 1,282.5 years in prison. Devin Erickson, now 20 years old, would spend the rest of his life behind bars. He would never walk free. He would never experience the life Kendrick Castillo and the other students he'd terrorized deserved to live. As he was led out of the courtroom, his family, his mother, father, sister, and grandfather, told him they loved him. His voice broke briefly, but he said nothing in return. In the days and weeks following the shooting, tributes to Kendrick Castillo poured in from around the world. Vigils were held. Memorials were erected, scholarships were established in his name. But the most meaningful tributes came from those who knew him best: his classmates, his teachers, his father. John Castillo became a vocal advocate for school safety and gun reform, channeling his grief into action. He spoke at rallies, testified before lawmakers, and worked tirelessly to ensure that his son's death would not be in vain. "Kendrick didn't hesitate," John said in one interview. "He didn't think about himself. He just acted, and I want his legacy to inspire others to be brave, to be selfless, to be heroes in their own lives." STEM school Highlands Ranch renamed its main gymnasium in Kendrick's honor. A mural depicting his heroism was painted on campus, and every year on May 7th, the school holds a ceremony to remember Kendrick and to celebrate the values he embodied: courage, selflessness, and love for others. Joshua Jones and Brendan Bialy, the two other students who charged the shooter, have also been honored for their bravery. Brendan went on to serve in the Marines, carrying Kendrick's memory with him. Joshua has spoken publicly about the shooting, emphasizing that Kendrick was the true hero and that he was simply following his lead. But perhaps the most important part of Kendrick's legacy is this: he saved lives. Students who are alive today, who graduated, who went to college, who got married, who had children, owe their futures to a teenager who made the ultimate sacrifice. Kendrick Castillo will never get to experience those milestones, but because of him, others will. While Kendrick Castillo's heroism is undeniable, the STEM school shooting also raises uncomfortable questions that the community and the nation must grapple with. Why didn't anyone stop Devin Erickson and Alec McKinney before they acted? In the aftermath, some warning signs emerged. Both had exhibited concerning behavior. McKinney had struggled with bullying and mental health issues. Erickson had become withdrawn and isolated. But nothing rose to the level that prompted intervention from parents, teachers, or school officials. The reality is that many school shooters don't fit a clear profile. They're not always the weird kid or the obvious outcast. Sometimes they're just troubled teenagers who hide their darkness well enough to avoid detection. Could the attack have been prevented? Possibly. If the weapons had been secured or reported, if mental health resources had been more accessible and less stigmatized, if the culture around violence and school shootings wasn't so deeply ingrained in American society. But hindsight is always clearer than foresight. The truth is, despite the best efforts of schools, law enforcement, and communities, some attacks slip through the cracks. And that's a reality that's as frustrating as it is heartbreaking. What about the victim-hero scenario? The twisted plan that Erikson and McKinney concocted, where McKinney would be both perpetrator and victim, reveals the warped thinking of teenagers immersed in the mythology of school shootings. They'd studied Columbine. They'd romanticized the killers. They really wanted to create their own legacy of violence. But they failed, because Kendrick Castillo and his classmates refused to let them. The STEM school shooting is a tragedy. There's no way around that truth. A young man is dead. 8 others were wounded. Dozens more were traumatized. And a community was forever changed. But it's also a story of extraordinary courage. In the span of seconds, Kendrick Castillo made a choice that most of us will never have to make. And most of us hope we'd have the courage to make if we did. He chose to run toward danger. He chose to protect others at the cost of his own life. He chose heroism over survival. And because of that choice, dozens of students went home to their families that day. They graduated. They went to college. They lived the lives they were meant to live. Kendrick Castillo's name is etched in history now, not as a victim, but as a hero. His story is taught in schools, shared in speeches, remembered at memorials. And every time someone hears his story, they're reminded of what true bravery looks like. Devin Erikson wanted to be remembered. He wanted infamy. He wanted his name spoken in the same breath as Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. But history won't remember him that way. Because when people think of the STEM school shooting, they don't think of the killer. They think of the hero. They think of Kendrick Castillo, the 18-year-old senior who, 3 days before graduation, gave his life to save his classmates. The young man who, in his final moments, embodied the very best of humanity. And that's a legacy Devin Erikson can never take away. Case 8. Alyssa Bustamante. October 21, 2009. St. Martins, Missouri. A small, quiet community where neighbors knew each other by name and children played outside until the streetlights came on. It was the kind of place where parents felt safe letting their kids walk to friends' houses, ride bikes down the street, play in the woods behind their homes. That sense of safety died on a Wednesday evening when 9-year-old Elizabeth Olton asked her mother if she could go outside to play with the neighbors. Her mother said yes. Elizabeth, wearing her favorite pink jacket, skipped out the door with a smile on her face. She never came home. Just 4 houses down lived 15-year-old Alyssa Bustamante, a babysitter Elizabeth knew and trusted. Alyssa seemed like a typical teenager. She attended church, got decent grades, and helped care for her younger siblings. But beneath that ordinary exterior lurked something monstrous. A week earlier, Alyssa had dug 2 graves in the woods behind her house. She'd been planning this moment, fantasizing about it, preparing for it. And when Elizabeth Olton walked toward her that evening, Alyssa saw not a child, not a neighbor, not a little girl who trusted her, but an opportunity. What happened next in those dark woods was an act of evil so pure, so senseless, that it would shock a nation and haunt a community forever. Because Alyssa Bustamante didn't kill Elizabeth Olton out of rage, revenge, or psychosis. She killed her because she wanted to know what it felt like. Alyssa Daylene Bustamante was born into chaos. Her mother, Michelle, struggled with addiction and mental health issues. Her father, Caesar, was serving time in prison for assault. By the time Alyssa was 7 years old, the state had intervened, and she and her 3 younger siblings were placed in the custody of their grandparents, Gary and Karen Brooke, who did their best to provide stability in an unstable situation. But the damage was already done. Alyssa struggled with depression and self-harm from an early age. In 2007, when she was just 13, she attempted suicide and was hospitalized. Mental health professionals diagnosed her with major depressive disorder and prescribed antidepressants, including Prozac, She attended therapy. Her grandparents tried to get her the help she needed. But something inside Alyssa was broken in a way that therapy and medication couldn't fix. Friends started noticing changes around 2007. Alyssa became fascinated with death and violence. On her YouTube profile, under the section for hobbies, she listed cutting and killing people. Most people who saw it assumed it was teenage edginess. Dark humor meant to shock. Nobody took it seriously. They should have. Alyssa posted photos of herself on social media with fake blood smeared around her mouth, her fingers shaped like a gun pointed at her head. She wrote poetry about death. She talked about wanting to hurt people. And in her private journal, a journal that would later become critical evidence, she wrote entries that revealed the depths of her disturbing fantasies. On the surface, Alyssa maintained a facade of normalcy. She attended the local Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints with her grandparents. She babysat for neighborhood families. She went to school, hung out with friends, acted like any other teenager, but inside, she was planning something unthinkable. Elizabeth K. Olten was 9 years old, a bright, energetic little girl with her whole life ahead of her. She lived just 4 houses down from the Bustamante home in their quiet St. Martin's neighborhood. Elizabeth knew Alyssa. She trusted her. Alyssa had babysat her before, played with her, acted like a responsible older neighbor. Elizabeth had no reason to be afraid of Alyssa Bustamante, and that's what made her the perfect victim. On the evening of October 21st, 2009, Elizabeth asked her mother, Patty Price, if she could go outside to play with the neighbors. It was a routine request, the kind that parents in safe neighborhoods say yes to 100 times. Patty said yes. Elizabeth put on her pink jacket and headed out the door, excited to play before dinner. She walked toward the Bustamante house, where Alyssa's younger sister was outside. What Elizabeth didn't know was that Alyssa had been waiting for this moment, that a week earlier, Alyssa had dug 2 graves in the woods behind her house, shallow, poorly concealed holes meant for a body, that Alyssa had been fantasizing about killing someone, anyone, and Elizabeth had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Elizabeth Olten was a child, innocent, trusting, full of life, and Alyssa Bustamante saw her as nothing more than an experiment. The plan was simple, calculated, and absolutely chilling. Alyssa told her younger sister to go outside and invite Elizabeth to play in the woods, a place the neighborhood kids often explored. The younger sister, innocent and unaware of what was about to happen, did as she was asked. Elizabeth agreed, excited to explore the woods with the neighbors, but when they reached the forest, Alyssa told her sister to wait outside. She wanted to show Elizabeth something special, she said. Just the 2 of them. Alyssa led Elizabeth deeper into the woods, away from houses, away from help, away from anyone who could save her. And then, in a clearing near the graves she dug a week earlier, Alyssa attacked. She strangled Elizabeth first, wrapping her hands around the little girl's throat and squeezing until Elizabeth couldn't breathe. But strangulation wasn't enough. Alyssa wanted more. She pulled out a knife and slit Elizabeth's throat. And still not satisfied, she stabbed the 9-year-old 8 times in the chest. Elizabeth Olten died alone in those woods, terrified and in pain, murdered by someone she trusted. She was 9 years old. After the killing, Alyssa dragged Elizabeth's body to one of the graves she'd prepared. She rolled the body into the shallow hole, covered it with leaves and debris, and walked away, leaving a little girl's corpse buried in the dirt like discarded trash. Then Alyssa went home, cleaned herself up, and did something that would later horrify investigators and the public. She went to a church dance. While Elizabeth's mother frantically searched the neighborhood, calling her daughter's name, knocking on doors, begging neighbors for help, while police were being called, search parties were forming, and a community was gripped with fear, Alyssa Bustamante was at church, smiling, laughing, acting like nothing had happened. And when she got home that night, she sat down and wrote in her journal. October 21st, 2009, the day of the murder. Alyssa Bustamante opened her personal journal and wrote an entry that would later be read aloud in court, leaving the courtroom and the nation speechless with horror. I just killed someone. I strangled them and slit their throat and stabbed them. Now they're dead. I don't know how to feel ATM. It was amazing. As soon as you get over the, oh my God, I can't do this feeling, it's pretty enjoyable. I'm kind of nervous and shaky though right now. Okay, I gotta go to church now, LOL. Read that again. Let it sink in. She described murdering a 9-year-old child as amazing and pretty enjoyable. She used internet slang, ATM at the moment, and LOL, laugh out loud, as casually as if she were writing about a movie she'd watched or a test she'd taken at school. She talked about getting over the initial hesitation and then finding the act of killing enjoyable. And then she went to church. This wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't a moment of rage or a psychotic break. It was premeditated, calculated murder, and Alyssa Bustamante enjoyed it. When prosecutors later presented this diary entry in court, Elizabeth's family wept. The gallery sat in stunned silence. Even hardened law enforcement officers struggled to comprehend the depravity of what they were reading. How does a 15-year-old girl become capable of such evil? How does someone write those words after taking a child's life? And how does she feel nothing? No guilt, no remorse, no horror at what she's done? The answers to those questions remain elusive, buried somewhere in the darkness of Alyssa Bustamante's mind. As Alyssa attended her church dance, Elizabeth's mother, Patty Price, was living every parent's worst nightmare. Elizabeth hadn't come home for dinner. She wasn't answering when her mother called her name. Neighbors hadn't seen her. Panic set in quickly. Patty called the police. Within hours, a full-scale search was underway. Law enforcement, volunteers, and neighbors combed the area, searching yards, woods, streets, anywhere a little girl might be. Investigators began interviewing neighbors, trying to piece together Elizabeth's last known movements. Multiple people reported seeing her walking toward the Bustamante house. When police spoke to Alyssa, she claimed she'd been home all evening and hadn't seen Elizabeth. But investigators weren't convinced. Something about Alyssa's demeanor was off. She seemed nervous, evasive, and when they asked if they could search the woods behind her house, she hesitated, just long enough to raise suspicion. On October 23, 2009, 2 days after Elizabeth disappeared, searchers found a disturbing sight in the woods behind the Bustamante home, freshly disturbed earth, poorly concealed with leaves and branches. They dug carefully, fearing what they would find. And there, in a shallow grave, was the body of Elizabeth Olten. She was still wearing her pink jacket. The coroner's examination revealed the brutal nature of her death. Strangulation, a slashed throat, and 8 stab wounds to the chest. This wasn't a quick killing. It was prolonged, violent, and sadistic. Investigators immediately turned their focus to Alyssa Bustamante. And when they searched her room, they found the journal, the diary entry that laid out in Alyssa's own handwriting exactly what she'd done. Alyssa was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. She was 15 years old. Alyssa Bustamante was initially charged as an adult with first-degree murder, a charge that, if convicted, would carry a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. For a 15-year-old, that meant spending the rest of her life behind bars with no hope of ever being released. Her defense attorneys knew the evidence was overwhelming. The diary entry alone was damning. Forensic evidence tied her to the crime. And the premeditation, the graves dug in advance, the use of her sister to lure Elizabeth, the planning, all pointed to first-degree murder. But the defense had one strategy: avoid a trial and negotiate a plea deal. In January 2012, after months of legal wrangling, Alyssa Bustamante agreed to plead guilty to lesser charges, second-degree murder and armed criminal action. By pleading guilty, she avoided the possibility of spending her entire life in prison without parole, a gamble that prosecutors accepted because it guaranteed a conviction and spared Elizabeth's family the trauma of a lengthy trial. The plea deal was controversial. Many people, including Elizabeth's family, felt that Alyssa deserved the harshest possible punishment. But prosecutors argued that given the U.S. Supreme Court's evolving stance on juvenile sentencing, a conviction for first-degree murder might not have held up on appeal. By accepting the plea, they ensured Alyssa would spend decades in prison. On February 8, 2012, Alyssa Bustamante appeared in court for her sentencing hearing. It was the first time Elizabeth's family would have the chance to confront the girl who'd murdered their daughter. The courtroom was packed. Elizabeth's mother, Patty Price, sat in the front row, flanked by family members and supporters. They waited, grief-stricken and furious, to finally hear from the person who'd taken Elizabeth from them. Before the sentencing, Alyssa was given the opportunity to make a statement. She stood, her voice shaking, and spoke directly to the Olten family. "I just want to say I'm sorry for what happened," she said, pausing to compose herself. "I know words can never be enough, and they can never adequately describe how horribly I feel for all of this. If I could give my life to bring her back, I would. I'm so sorry." The words sounded rehearsed, hollow. Elizabeth's family sat stone-faced, tears streaming down their faces. No apology could bring Elizabeth back. No words could undo the horror of what Alyssa had done. Prosecutors presented the diary entry, reading it aloud for the court. The gallery gasped. Patty Price sobbed. The juxtaposition was stark. Alyssa's tearful apology versus her own written words describing the murder as amazing and pretty enjoyable. Missouri State Highway Patrol Sergeant David Rice testified about his interview with Alyssa after her arrest. He recounted how she'd told him, calmly and without emotion, that she wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone. There was no deeper motive, no justification, no explanation beyond curiosity and a desire to experience murder. Prosecutor Mark Richardson argued for a harsh sentence, asking for life in prison plus 71 years, 1 year for each year of life Elizabeth Olten lost. He called Alyssa a truly evil individual who strangled and stabbed an innocent child simply for the thrill of it. Judge Patricia Joyce listened to the testimony, reviewed the evidence, and ultimately sentenced Alyssa Bustamante to life in prison for second-degree murder and 30 years for armed criminal action, to be served consecutively. Because Alyssa was a juvenile at the time of the crime, she would be eligible for parole, but not for many, many years. As Alyssa was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Elizabeth's family felt a small measure of justice. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But at least the girl who'd murdered their daughter would spend most of her life behind bars. For Patty Price and her family, life after Elizabeth's murder has been an unending nightmare. Patty has spoken publicly about the devastating impact of losing her daughter, not just losing her, but losing her in such a horrific, senseless way. "I will never walk my son down the aisle," Patty said in one victim impact statement. "He'll never come say anything to me 'cause he's not here. He's resting in power. All the good things my son did, the memories will always be with me." Note: Patty misspoke, referring to Elizabeth as her son. This was an emotional moment and a slip of the tongue. Elizabeth's siblings have grown up without their sister. They've had to process the unimaginable, that someone they knew, someone from their own neighborhood, someone they trusted, murdered their little sister for no reason at all. The community of St. Martin's was also forever changed. Parents became more cautious. Children were no longer allowed to play unsupervised. The sense of safety that once defined the neighborhood was shattered by the knowledge that evil could live just 4 houses down. And Alyssa's family, her grandparents, her siblings, were also victims in their own way. They'd tried to help Alyssa, to get her treatment, to give her stability. And yet, despite their best efforts, they couldn't stop her from becoming a killer. In 2024, Alyssa Bustamante became eligible for her first parole hearing, 15 years after the murder, as required by Missouri law for juvenile offenders. The news devastated Elizabeth's family, who'd believed Alyssa would be in prison for much longer before being considered for release. The parole hearing was the result of Senate Bill 26, a Missouri law designed to give juvenile offenders a chance at redemption. The law was intended to apply only to those convicted of lesser crimes, excluding first-degree murder. But because Alyssa had pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, she qualified for early parole consideration. Patty Price and her family were outraged. They felt betrayed by a system that seemed to value the rights of a killer over the memory of a murdered child. Patty received an automated call on Mother's Day 2024 informing her of Alyssa's upcoming parole hearing, a cruel irony that added insult to injury. In response, Missouri lawmakers introduced Senate Bill 754, nicknamed Elizabeth's Law, which would close the loophole and prevent those convicted of second-degree murder from receiving early parole. The bill passed both chambers of the state legislature and was sent to Governor Mike Parson for approval. But Parson didn't sign the bill in time to prevent Alyssa's parole hearing, which took place on July 8, 2024. Patty Price and her supporters attended the hearing, begging the parole board not to release Alyssa. Patty delivered a powerful statement, reliving the horror of her daughter's murder and pleading for justice. "I will relive my pain for them if it means it could make any difference at all," Patty said. "There is very little I can do for my daughter now but show up." The parole board deliberated for weeks, and on a day that felt like a small victory for justice, they announced their decision: parole denied. Alyssa Bustamante would remain in prison. Her next parole hearing wouldn't be until 2059, when she'll be 65 years old. Even then, she would still have to serve the consecutive 30-year sentence for armed criminal action, meaning her earliest possible release date is decades away. For Elizabeth's family, it was a moment of relief. But the fight isn't over. Every few years, Alyssa will have the opportunity to petition for parole again, and every time, Elizabeth's family will have to relive the nightmare, fighting to keep their daughter's killer behind bars. Of all the cases in this documentary, Alyssa Bustamante's is perhaps the most disturbing because of its sheer senselessness. There was no revenge motive, no history of abuse by the victim, no delusions or hallucinations driving her actions. Alyssa Bustamante killed Elizabeth Olten because she wanted to know what it felt like. Psychologists who evaluated Alyssa diagnosed her with major depressive disorder. Her defense team argued that her use of Prozac may have made her more prone to violent impulses. But mental illness doesn't explain away evil. Millions of people struggle with depression and take antidepressants. They don't murder children. So what was it? What made Alyssa capable of digging graves, luring a little girl into the woods, and committing such unspeakable violence? Some experts point to her traumatic childhood, the neglect, the instability, the lack of parental attachment. Others suggest she may have antisocial personality disorder or psychopathic traits that mental health professionals missed. But in the end, no explanation feels adequate, because no explanation can justify what she did, and no diagnosis can bring Elizabeth Olten back. In the years since Elizabeth's murder, her family has worked tirelessly to honor her memory and prevent other families from experiencing the same nightmare. Patty Price has become an advocate for victims' rights and juvenile sentencing reform. She fought for Elizabeth's Law to close the parole loophole that allowed Alyssa to be considered for early release. And while the law didn't pass in time to stop the 2024 hearing, it has since been enacted ensuring future juvenile offenders convicted of second-degree murder will face longer sentences before parole eligibility. Elizabeth's story has also sparked broader conversations about mental health, warning signs, and the responsibilities of parents, schools, and communities to identify troubled youth before they commit violence. But for Patty Price, no amount of advocacy or legal reform can fill the void left by her daughter's absence. "Elizabeth matters," Patty said in one statement. "She was a caring and loving young woman full of life, and she deserves to be remembered, not as a victim of a senseless crime, but as a beautiful little girl who brought joy to everyone who knew her." The murder of Elizabeth Olten is a tragedy that defies comprehension. A 9-year-old girl full of life and innocence was brutally killed by a teenage neighbor who saw her as nothing more than an experiment. A family was shattered, a community was traumatized, and a nation was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes evil wears the face of a teenage girl. Alyssa Bustamante sits in prison today, serving a sentence that will likely keep her behind bars for the rest of her life. She's expressed remorse in court, but her diary entry, those chilling words about how amazing and pretty enjoyable the murder was, will haunt her forever. They're a permanent record of who she was in that moment, a killer without conscience, a teenager who murdered a child and felt nothing but satisfaction. Elizabeth Olten never got to grow up. She never got to experience first love, high school graduation, or the countless joys and milestones of life. She was 9 years old, with dreams and a future, and all of it was stolen by someone she trusted. And Alyssa Bustamante, she wanted to know what it felt like to kill. She got her answer. And now, for the rest of her life, she'll live with the consequences of that choice. A life spent behind bars, forever defined by the 9-year-old girl she murdered in the woods. In the end, there are no winners in this story, only victims, and a little girl in a pink jacket who will never come home. Case 9, Nathaniel Brazil. It was the last day of school at Lake Worth Middle School in Florida, May 26, 2000. A Friday afternoon when most 13-year-olds were thinking about summer vacation, about sleeping in and freedom from homework. Nathaniel Brazil was thinking about something else entirely. He was a 7th grader, not a troubled kid in the traditional sense. He had friends, he liked his teachers. By most accounts, he was a normal middle school student navigating the complicated transition from childhood to adolescence. But normal, as investigators would later discover, was a facade that hid a home life marked by chaos and violence. That morning, Nathaniel did what countless students do on the last day of school. He celebrated. He and some friends threw water balloons. It was harmless. It was typical. It was the kind of thing that usually results in a stern warning or maybe detention. But the school administration saw it differently. They suspended him, sent him home early, told him his last day of school was over before it had really begun. For most students, that would have been the end of it, an inconvenience, a minor disappointment. But for Nathaniel Brazil, something shifted. He wanted to go back. He wanted to say goodbye to his friends. He wanted to see his girlfriend before summer break scattered everyone. And he wanted to see Mr. Grunow. Barry Grunow was 35 years old. He taught English. He was the kind of teacher students remembered years later. Patient, funny, genuinely invested in his students' success. He was married. He had 2 young children at home. His students called him their favorite teacher. Nathaniel Brazil called him that too. When Nathaniel arrived home that afternoon, his grandfather's house was empty. The .25 caliber handgun was not locked away. It was accessible. Nathaniel took it. He would later claim he only wanted to scare people, to get their attention, to make them take him seriously. He rode his bike back to school. He walked through doors that should have been locked but were not. He moved through hallways that were emptying out as the school year ended. He went to Mr. Grunow's classroom, room 111. The door was closed. Students were inside finishing up end-of-year activities. Nathaniel knocked. Mr. Grunow came to the door. Nathaniel asked to go inside. He wanted to say goodbye to two girls in the class. He wanted to see his friends one last time before summer. Mr. Grunow said no. It was school policy. Nathaniel had been suspended. He could not be in the classroom. It was not personal. It was not punishment beyond what had already been decided. It was simply the rule. Nathaniel pulled the gun from his pocket. He pointed it at his favorite teacher. Witnesses would later describe the moment in fragments: the flash, the sound, the way Mr. Grunow stumbled backward. The single bullet entered his head. He collapsed. Students screamed. Nathaniel stood there for a moment, then turned and walked away. Barry Grunow died in the doorway of his classroom. He died doing what teachers do every day, enforcing boundaries, protecting his students, following school policy. He died on the last day of school, minutes before summer vacation would have begun. Police arrived within minutes. They found Nathaniel outside the school. He did not run. He did not resist. He told officers he did not mean to kill Mr. Grunow. He said he thought the safety was on. He said he only wanted to scare him, to make him let Nathaniel into the classroom. He said it was an accident. But investigators did not see an accident. They saw a 13-year-old who went home specifically to retrieve a weapon. They saw a boy who returned to school with a loaded gun. They saw someone who pointed that gun at a teacher's head and pulled the trigger. Intent, they argued, was written into every choice he made that afternoon. The question of whether Nathaniel Brazil intended to kill Barry Grunow would define his trial. His defense attorneys painted a picture of a child, a boy from a broken home. There had been 17 police reports from his residence in the 6 years before the shooting. Domestic violence, alcoholism, chaos that no child should have to navigate. They argued that Nathaniel was impulsive, not murderous, that he made a catastrophically bad decision, but did not wake up that morning planning to kill his favorite teacher. Prosecutors saw it differently. They pointed to the deliberate steps: the decision to retrieve the gun, the ride back to school, the approach to the classroom, the moment he raised the weapon and aimed it at another human being. They argued that even if Nathaniel did not plan to kill, he made choices that demonstrated a reckless disregard for life. Whether he meant to pull the trigger or whether the gun fired accidentally became almost irrelevant in the face of those choices. The decision to try Nathaniel as an adult was controversial from the start. He was 13 years old. In many states, 13-year-olds cannot drive, cannot vote, cannot sign contracts because the law recognizes they lack the judgment and foresight of adults. But Florida law allowed prosecutors to charge him as an adult for murder. The question before the court was whether a child who kills should be treated as a child or as a criminal. The trial began in May 2001, almost exactly 1 year after Barry Grunow's death. Jurors heard from ballistics experts who explained how the gun worked. They heard from students who witnessed the shooting. They heard from Nathaniel's family about the violence and instability he lived with. They heard from Pam Grunow, Barry's widow, who described the husband and father her children would grow up without. After days of testimony, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of second-degree murder, guilty of aggravated assault with a firearm. The conviction acknowledged that while Nathaniel may not have planned to kill, he created the circumstances that made death inevitable. He brought a loaded gun to school. He pointed it at his teacher. Whether his finger squeezed the trigger intentionally or whether the gun discharged from poor handling, Barry Grunow was dead because of decisions Nathaniel made. In July 2001, the judge sentenced Nathaniel Brazil to 28 years in prison, followed by 7 years of probation. At 13 years old, he would not be eligible for release until he was 41. The courtroom was divided. Some saw justice for a beloved teacher. Others saw a child being condemned to spend his entire youth and young adulthood behind bars. Pam Grunow, Barry's widow, later won a $1.2 million settlement against the gun's distributor in a wrongful death lawsuit. She argued that the weapon, manufactured without basic safety features, was unreasonably dangerous. The settlement did not bring her husband back. It did not give her children their father, but it represented acknowledgement that adults had failed to keep weapons away from children. The years in prison changed Nathaniel Brazil in ways that are difficult to measure from the outside. He earned his GED. He completed a paralegal certification program. He filed lawsuits challenging prison conditions and won. In 2024, he successfully sued prison officials over First Amendment violations, demonstrating a grasp of legal concepts that perhaps would have developed differently had he not been forced to navigate the prison system from adolescence. He is now incarcerated at Quincy Annex in Florida. His scheduled release date is May 2028, less than 3 years away. He will be 41 years old. He will have spent more than half his life in prison. The boy who threw water balloons on the last day of school will walk out as a middle-aged man who has never held a job, never lived independently, never experienced the normal milestones of adulthood. The gym at Lake Worth Middle School was renamed in Barry Grunow's honor. His memory lives on in the building where he taught, where he died, where students continued to learn despite the violence that shattered one ordinary Friday afternoon. His children grew up without him. His widow rebuilt a life marked permanently by loss. The case of Nathaniel Brazil continues to surface in debates about juvenile justice. How much responsibility can a 13-year-old bear for a split-second decision with permanent consequences? If he truly believed the gun would not fire, does that change the moral calculus of his guilt? Should children who kill be tried as adults, or does that reflect a failure to acknowledge the profound difference between adolescent brains and fully developed ones? There are no easy answers. Barry Grunow is gone. His family will never get him back. Nathaniel Brazil has spent his entire youth in prison. 2 lives were destroyed on the last day of school in 2000. One ended. The other was frozen in a moment of catastrophic judgment. The question that lingers is the one that haunted the trial and continues to divide those who remember the case. Was it murder, or was it recklessness? Was it intent, or was it accident? And does the answer to those questions change what we owe to children who make choices they cannot take back? Even today, the name Nathaniel Brazil remains a reminder that the line between childhood and accountability is far more complicated than any courtroom can resolve. Case 10, Jalen Prince. September 6, 2024. A Friday morning at Joppatown High School in Harford County, Maryland. Students were settling into the second week of the new school year. Lockers slammed. Conversations echoed through hallways. The rhythm of another academic year was just beginning to take shape. Inside the boys' bathroom, an argument was about to end a life. Jalen Prince was 16 years old. Warren Grant was 15. They were classmates. They moved through the same hallways, sat in some of the same classes, existed in the overlapping social circles that define high school life. But on that Friday morning, they were arguing about a girl. The details of the dispute were typical of teenage conflict. Warren had been spending time with a girl that Jalen had feelings for. Jalen had told other students to stay away from her. He had made his interest known. He had made his displeasure clear. Warren had not listened. The tension between them had been building. What made this argument different from thousands of others that happen in high school bathrooms every day was what Jalen Prince had brought to school in his backpack. On August 12, 2024, less than a month earlier, he had purchased a gun. He paid $700. The transaction happened through Cash App. The weapon was not registered. It was not legal. It was exactly the kind of firearm that flows through underground markets and ends up in the hands of teenagers who should never have access to them. Jaylen had taken photos of the gun on his phone. He had ammunition. He had brought both to school that morning. Whether he woke up planning to use them, or whether he simply wanted the security of having them, is a question that would later consume his defense. But the gun was there, loaded, accessible, in his backpack as he walked into that bathroom. Another student was there when the argument escalated. He had his phone out. He was recording. The video that would later be played in court captured everything, the voices rising, the tension building, and then Jaylen's words, clear and deliberate, "I'm going to kill you." There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. The threat was explicit. Warren Grant heard it. The student recording heard it. And moments later, Jaylen Prince made good on it. He reached into his backpack. His hand emerged with the gun. Warren saw it. There was no time to run, no time to de-escalate, no time for anyone to intervene. Jaylen fired. The shot echoed through the bathroom, through the hallway, through a school that was supposed to be safe. Warren Grant fell into the corner. He was 15 years old. He died there. Jaylen walked out of the bathroom. Students were screaming. Teachers were running toward the sound. Within minutes, Joppatown High School was in lockdown. Police arrived quickly. They found Warren Grant's body. They secured the scene. They began searching for the shooter. Jaylen Prince was arrested within hours. The gun was never recovered. Investigators believe he ditched it somewhere between the bathroom and his arrest, but despite extensive searches, the weapon that killed Warren Grant was never found. What they did find was evidence on Jaylen's phone, photos of a gun that matched the caliber of the bullets recovered from Warren's body, messages referencing the weapon, digital breadcrumbs that painted a picture of a teenager who had armed himself weeks before the confrontation. The video changed everything. Without it, the case might have hinged on witness testimony, on conflicting accounts of who said what and when. But the recording eliminated doubt. Jurors would not have to imagine the moment. They would not have to piece together fragments from traumatized witnesses. They could watch it. They could hear Jaylen's voice. They could see him reach into his backpack. They could watch Warren Grant die. Jaylen's defense attorneys faced an almost impossible task. Their client had been recorded threatening to kill someone and then immediately doing exactly that. But they built their case around intent. Jaylen Prince was 16 years old. He testified that he did not mean to kill Warren Grant. He claimed the shooting was not premeditated. He argued that in the heat of the argument, with emotions running high and judgment clouded by teenage anger, he made a catastrophic mistake. Prosecutors disagreed. They pointed to August 12th. The gun purchase. $700 transferred through an app for a weapon he had no legal right to own. They pointed to the photos on his phone. The ammunition, the decision to bring the gun to school on September 6th. They argued that Jaylen Prince had armed himself, carried a loaded weapon into a place filled with children, and when challenged by a 15-year-old over a girl, he chose murder. The trial moved quickly. By May 2025, less than a year after Warren Grant's death, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for just 3 hours. The brevity of their deliberation spoke volumes. The video had done what videos do. It removed uncertainty. It forced them to confront what Jaylen Prince had done in real time, in his own words, with his own hands. The verdict was guilty. First-degree murder. Weapons charges. Jaylen Prince stood as the judge read the jury's decision. He would spend the rest of his life in prison. The sentence was life with all but 75 years suspended, plus 5 years for the weapons charge. 80 years total. He would be in his 90s before he could even be considered for release. The state's attorney was clear about the message the sentence was meant to send. Bringing firearms to schools would result in adult consequences regardless of age. The days of treating school violence as youthful indiscretion were over. Jaylen Prince was 16, but he would be held accountable as an adult for adult decisions. For Warren Grant's family, the conviction could not restore what was taken. Their 15-year-old son was gone. He had been arguing about a girl. He had been doing what teenagers do, navigating the complicated social dynamics of high school, figuring out relationships and boundaries and where he fit. He did not deserve to die for it. The community struggled to process what had happened. Joppatown High School was supposed to be safe. Parents send their children to school expecting they will come home. September 6th shattered that expectation. Metal detectors were discussed. Security measures were reviewed. But no amount of infrastructure could undo the fact that a student had walked through the doors with a gun and murdered a classmate over a girl. The case raises questions that extend far beyond Harford County. How did a 16-year-old acquire a gun? Where did the $700 come from? Who sold him the weapon, and why was there no mechanism to stop the transaction? The gun was never found, which means it could still be out there. It could be in another teenager's hands. It could be waiting for the next argument to turn fatal. Jalen Prince is now imprisoned. He will spend decades behind bars for a decision that took seconds. He brought a gun to school. He threatened to kill. He fired. Whether he woke up that morning planning murder or whether the shooting was a spontaneous act of rage matters less than the permanence of the outcome. Warren Grant is dead. Jalen Prince's life is over in every meaningful sense. 2 families are destroyed. The video remains. It was played in court. It will exist as evidence forever. Future juries in future cases will likely see it as an example of what happens when teenage conflict meets access to firearms. Jalen's voice saying, "I'm going to kill you," will echo beyond that bathroom, beyond that school, beyond that trial. The case is a reminder that school violence is not slowing down. It is not a problem of the past or a trend that peaked and faded. September 6, 2024 was 8 months ago. The wound is fresh. Warren Grant's family is still grieving. Joppatown High School is still processing. And Jalen Prince is learning what it means to spend the rest of his life paying for 3 seconds of violence. Even today, the name Jalen Prince serves as a warning that the consequences of bringing a gun to school are absolute, that teenage anger mixed with deadly weapons creates tragedies that courtrooms can judge but can never undo. These 10 students spanning ages 13 to 28, crimes from 2000 to 2024, transformed schools and universities from places of promise into scenes of unthinkable violence. Some showed warning signs that went unheeded. Others revealed no history of trouble before they killed. What unites them is the devastating permanence of their choices and the families forever fractured by loss. As we recount their crimes, we honor their victims by asking the difficult questions their deaths demand. How do we detect danger before it strikes? How do we balance accountability with the reality of developing brains? And how do we ensure that the next generation of students never appears on a list like this? The answers remain incomplete, but the urgency is undeniable. Which of these cases shocked you the most? And do you think juvenile offenders who commit murder should ever be eligible for parole? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this video made you think differently about school safety or youth justice, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into true crime cases that force us to confront uncomfortable truths. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an upload.